Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK 2026 off-season and roster grades video. Very excited to get into the LCK version of this video. We dropped the LEC and the LCS versions of this video a couple of days ago. It's been about a week since the first one came out. Both of those have been performing incredibly well. I'm so thankful if you are new to the channel because of either the LEC or the LCS, videos that we posted. Hello, welcome to the channel. Obviously, if you're sticking around, that means that you at the very least were intrigued by some of the grades that I gave. I know those videos have received, a mixed opinion, we'll just say. Overall, very much positive in terms of, especially the LCS video, gotten a lot of great feedback. And, I know a lot of people were kind of introduced to the channel because of those videos. But, if you've stuck around, hopefully you will continue to appreciate some of the work that I'm putting in here, because if you thought that the opinions were controversial in the Western videos, in the LEC and the LCS, that certainly is not going to change here for the LCK video. I'm super excited to give my thoughts on the direction that every single team went in this offseason, and obviously talk about where I think teams are going to land in 2026. If you're excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. As per usual, I want to hear from you guys down in the comments. What do you agree with in this video, and what do you disagree with in this video? I'm always so curious to know where I'm kind of with consensus and where I'm against consensus. I don't really consume as much like other league content in terms of analysts. Like, I'll tune in every once in a while, but generally I don't really know what the general league population thinks about certain players or certain moves. And so if I have an opinion that's like super against the grain and definitely isn't something that a lot of people are feeling, please let me know down in the comment section below. All I can do is give you my authentic and real thoughts, and I'm happy to do that. I know I very much am against, public opinion for the most part with a lot of things that I go for on this channel, but I think that's what makes it a little bit more fascinating to talk about. So without further ado, let's get into the video itself. If you haven't watched those other two videos, if you're kind of finding me through the LCK version of this, hello, my name is K-Man. I've been covering the LCK every single game on this channel since 2022. I've been officially tracking stats for various websites and various outlets for many years. Before that, for basically every single major region, so I have quite a repository of games in terms of being able to cover what is happening here. I basically have watched every single game of almost every single player in the LCK's history, unless you're like Faker, who's been playing for over a decade. Couldn't quite watch every single game in 2013 when I was in high school, but I certainly did try my best. I've definitely kept up with the LCK, we'll just say, and so I have a pretty good idea and understanding of the career paths and general trajectories of a lot of these players. I also watch most, if not every single game of the Challengers League as well. I don't cover that on the channel because I already make enough content as it is. I've made thousands and thousands of hours of content just on last year alone on this channel, but definitely am pretty familiar with a lot of the Challengers League players. This is the other tier 2 league besides the NACL that I'm really kind of plugged in on in terms of watching a lot of players, because, LCK Challengers League players go to top tier regions all the time. Everybody is scouting from the LCK tier 2. So I have a pretty good idea and understanding of how these players have, kind of developed and what I can expect from them. But that kind of brings up the housekeeping that we always have to go over at the start of these videos. I've gotten some comments that are thankful for the housekeeping section. I know it's like 10 minutes, but this is going to be over an hour. Like, this is a podcast. If you want to skip around, there's going to be timestamps in the description for each individual team, but I do want to give some brief ground rules at the start of this, as I always do. First and foremost, let's throw up the key on the screen here for the grades that I will be using throughout the rest of this video. We're going to be grading every single player, and whether or not it was an upgrade, a downgrade, a change, all of that stuff from who was in that spot on that team in the previous year. The big piece of housekeeping, the big caveat I have to say at the start of the video, as per usual though, this is just my opinion. I really cannot stress that enough. Every single year, I get people in the comments section telling me that I clearly don't watch the games, that I clearly have no idea what I'm talking about, that my opinion can't be taken seriously. And if you have that belief, that's totally fine. I don't need everybody to sit here and say that, my opinion should be taken over consensus or anything like that. But I do say all of that to kind of preface the fact that I am at least coming from somewhere knowledgeable. I've watched every single game of the LCK and covered it on this channel. So, the comments that always make me laugh are the ones that are like, you clearly don't know what you're talking about, or you clearly don't watch the games. I just find that very funny, considering I have, again, thousands upon thousands of hours covering the LCK on this channel. But if your opinion is different from mine, that's great. I'm not sitting here, putting it out with the expectation that everybody is going to completely agree. If you have something that you disagree with, please let me know know constructively down in the comment section below. Again, I'm really curious to know where my views kind of line up with consensus and where they're maybe not quite as consensus. Always very curious to know where that lands, but take everything I say with a grain of salt, and specifically take this grading scale with a grain of salt. I really only include these letter grades in this video for like visual purposes and you know, for algorithm purposes, because it gets people talking in the comments. These grades are very flexible. They are very malleable in terms of where you might want to put a player. Really, the grades are just an indicator of the words that I'm saying. They are a secondary tool in this video. If you even watch the video without seeing any of the grades, I think you would get a very similar experience. I urge people to kind of take what I say about a player over just, you know, the one letter grade that you see on the screen. I know I put them in the videos, you know, for that visual indicator, but again, don't take everything too seriously here. This is more so just, you know, kind of an overall representation of maybe where I land on a player, especially if they're within the same tier. I would say there's 3 tiers of players here. There's the A tier, the B tier, and the C tier. Any of the players in the A tier can kind of move up or down within that A tier relatively flexibly. Same thing for B, same thing for C. We'll go into the specific differences between like a B plus and a B minus and everything like that. But if you're a B plus or a B, you're probably a player that I could see, you know, being pretty interchangeable throughout a majority of the year. I'll talk about maybe why I feel better about certain players than others, or more confident about certain players than others. But for the most part, I wouldn't get too tangled up in the weeds if one player is one letter grade off what you're thinking. If you have a player at B plus and I put them at B and kind of talk about some of their negatives, I'm probably not all that much lower on them than you are. It's just a few more things that might be a bit more inconsistent in my brain. But that's the biggest piece of housekeeping that I want to get out of the way. Let's go ahead and talk about the grading scale here. You can see it goes from A plus to C minus. I have given out D grades before, but that is very, very rare. I'm talking Taeyun like in 2023. Like that kind of player was just, you know, that's the only D I think I've ever given out on this channel. So no Ds to cover in today. We just go from A plus to C minus. Starting with A plus, this is going to be your best of the region. This is your consistent MVP frontrunner. There's usually only one A plus player in each region at any given moment. In fact, there might even be regions without an A plus player. Right now, I don't think there's any regions without an A plus player, but there have been in the past. I've talked about it. The LCS very recently got an A plus player in Inspired, but for the past couple of years, I don't think there had been a player of that caliber. This is somebody that immediately elevates whatever team they're on to being a championship contender, regardless of what kind of surrounding core you have. It is very, very rare to have an A plus caliber player. This is, you know, best in the world kind of territory, especially in the LCK. Your A's are going to be your superstars. These are your other MVP frontrunners that just maybe aren't A pluses. These are players that are consistently top 1 or top 2 in their own individual positions, are going to be competing to win the LCK basically every single year, but maybe don't quite have the same consistency or like domination that other A plus players have. Like you're not 1 of 1, you're more like 1 of 5, which is still really good, but A is just, you know, a little bit more, I guess, open. A minus is still going to be elite. I get a lot of comments, especially on these LCK videos, where people think I'm disrespecting a player by putting them A minus. This is borderline top 1 or top 2 in your position, but maybe have some inconsistencies that the top, you know, A plus A players don't have on a game to game or week to week basis, or alternatively are players that I just think are a little bit more limited in their skill set. They might be the best player on, you know, a weaker team, or alternatively, they might be like, I would say, the second or third best player on a genuinely great team, right? Like these aren't your, you know, top of the top guys, but they're very close. Like elite is still elite. It's not supposed to be some sort of disrespect to have a player at A minus. I feel like that's usually the big confusion that I get down in the comments section. And then once you start getting into the Bs, these are your, you know, starters that I feel good about, but maybe aren't like superstars. The only real difference between B plus and B is going to be how confident I feel you are going to be this good going into 2026. B plus is going to be your consistently good starters. These are players that maybe aren't quite in that elite tier, aren't the ones that are going to be competing to win MVP or anything like that, but are still excellent players. And, you know, likely you can, you know, make, and not only make, but like actually do really well at the World Championships with a variety of B plus players, maybe just not quite as the best player on the team, if that makes sense. These are your very stable, very solid starters. You know, I'm not going to give a ton of examples for these letter grades because we're going to go, you know, through a lot of these players, but think someone like Cuz, who's just been really good over the course of his career, maybe isn't like an MVP favorite. You know, Showmaker's another good example of this. Players that are very good, but maybe not quite top of the top right now. And again, the only difference between B plus and B is going to be that consistency. Once you get into B, these are players that likely have the same kind of highs as a B plus player, can at any point play like a B plus player, even an A minus player. But I just don't feel quite as confident that we're definitely going to get that in 2026. Like there is at least some sort of risk or a slightly lower floor on a player like this. That, you know, we'll go through those specific examples as we talk about these players, but I wouldn't especially get caught up in the weeds, I should say, between B plus and B. I think, relatively similar players just in terms of floor. One's going to be a little bit more consistent than the other. Once you start getting to B minus, these are going to be your okay starters. This is kind of the final tier, the final grade of player where I'm like, I get why you would want to start them in the LCK. I think they're a starting caliber player in the LCK. Maybe they're not, ever going to be like a breakthrough star, or maybe they're not proven at all. Maybe they're an LCK Challengers League player that still has a lot of room to grow. Either way, like, these are players that I think have earned a starting spot in the LCK, but aren't going to be, projected as superstars from day number one. These are kind of the bottom tier of what I would consider to be good starters, like not passable starters. These are your average players, your league average players, somewhere between 4 and 7 in terms of their own position, if that makes sense. And then once you start getting into the Cs, your C plus is going to be a weak starter. This is where things get a little bit more murky in terms of the waters. I can see an organization wanting to start a C plus player, especially if they're, a Challengers League player being brought up or something like that. But I certainly have more questions on C plus players than I do on B minus players. This is kind of an indicator that, you could either be an okay starter or you could be bad. Like, I think B minus, starters are usually not going to be absolutely terrible unless they're just kind of falling off of a cliff or on an organization that can't really capitalize on their advantages. C plus is weak starter. These are players that I think you are probably going to be the first to get pulled if things end up going wrong for individual teams. Then once you start getting to C, C is going to be your borderline starter. These are players that I would push back on having a starting spot in the LCK. I think there would have been better options available, even if they were youth prospects, and generally I think have proven themselves to not be, consistent starting caliber in the LCK, top 10 worthy in the LCK, but I don't think they're absolutely disastrous. They're just kind of below average. And then once you get to C minus, I'm not sure if there are any C minuses in this video. I don't quite remember. I'll be going over that throughout the rest of this, but if there is a C minus, that is not a starter. That is somebody who has proven at the LCK level that they are not good enough to be at the LCK level, and I quite frankly find it insulting that they have a starting spot. I've had some of those in the LEC and the LCS, not quite any of those here in the LCK. So that's the grading scale. Obviously, this is, I can't reiterate this enough, this is more of a visual aid than anything else. Take the words that I say about each player more literally than the grades themselves up on the screen. But, the grades are there for a reason. They're not entirely useless. But with all of that preamble, the 12-minute preamble out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the video itself. If you are new to the way that we do these videos, what we're going to do is go in order of how these teams finished in the summer split domestically in the LCK, starting from 1st and going to 10th in terms of how they ended up going and talking about their offseason, which means we get to start with the defending LCK champions and a team that, didn't make any changes, but certainly has a lot of storylines to talk about. It's Gen.G, obviously your back-to-back LCK champions in both spring and summer, but no roster movement for Gen.G going into 2026. I think that should have been obvious to anybody who watched this team. They didn't need another year, that it should have been 2025, and we'll talk about that at least a little bit in terms of a world championship, but, if you had the chance to run this core back, you absolutely should. There are a lot of comments over the course of this offseason that I'm super excited to finally address because I've been getting them for months on my Worlds videos, and I finally have a chance to talk about Canyon and the way that I feel about him as a player, even Chovy. I know there's already going to be some people that are upset by some of the grades you're seeing on the screen, but I'm happy to go ahead and defend them. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is still looking like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and Duro at support. What you're seeing on the screen isn't quite a great example of what you're going to see the rest of this video. On the top side of this screen, you are going to see the team from last year. The bottom side is going to be the team in 2026. Obviously, the letter grades for each player are going to be listed there. There are 4 possible things you can see in the middle of the screen. Either no change, which is going to be obviously it's the same player as last year, so you're not really adjusting. You can see upgrade or downgrade there if I think it's just a straight up upgrade or downgrade in that position, or kind of a neutral change, which is either, a side grade, players that I think are relatively even in terms of skill level, or alternatively, kind of sacrificing in the short term to potentially grow in the long term if you're bringing up a young prospect, even if they might be a little bit lower in terms of my grades. I hope that all makes sense. With that out of the way, let's talk about Gen.G. Let's get some of the elephants out of the room first, because I know people really want to hear my thoughts on Canyon at the very least, because I was really high on him going into Worlds, and that seemed to be an opinion that absolutely nobody else ended up holding. I don't know if there was a popular streamer who was like shitting on Canyon, but boy, was that just like a consensus opinion that everybody had throughout last year, which I just don't really understand watching a lot of the games. And then obviously Chovy is going to get a lot of coverage. We'll just say here he is the only A+ grade in this video, and I'll defend that right off the bat. First and foremost, this is an LCK rankings video. This is not a Worlds ranking video. If you want to sit here and say that, Chovy shows up at Worlds and that how can you consider him an A+ player when he's always choking, first and foremost, You can't really show me an example of this guy choking in the LCK. Like, it just doesn't really happen. He is dominant domestically. He is arguably the most dominant domestic player ever. Faker obviously had that run of dominance between 2013 and 2017 where things were just absolutely astronomical, but Chovy's modern era, at least from an LCK perspective, matches up very well against Faker's domestic dominance from that. Bare minimum, he's top 2 all time in terms of, you know, how much he's been able to win from a domestic perspective, and that has to be an A+. Like, I'm sorry, during the season, during the regular season, during the LCK, he is the best player in the world every single year, and he has been since 2022. Again, if you want to try and make an argument that, oh, he wouldn't be an A+ because he always chokes at Worlds, I mean, you can make that argument from an overall Chovy perspective, but again, if you want to try to win the LCK, there's absolutely no one better right now at doing that than Chovy. There is just no argument for that conversation. He is the only A+ grade in this video, and if you want to continue to say that Chovy's overrated, go argue with the wall. I'm not the guy, right? Like, I'm not the guy to sit here and tell you anything other than that Chovy is the best player in the world. In fact, I'm one of the biggest Chovy defenders, I think, of all the analysts. I think this guy continues to prove year in and year out that he has what it takes to be a legend, like a top 2 or top 3 player of all time. He just needs that world championship. But the other controversial player here is Canyon. I got so much hate for putting Canyon, I believe, what, like 5th or something like that, 6th in my Worlds player rankings, you know, somewhere near the top 5. People were not happy about that. He was the #1 jungler in that video, and I got a lot of comments that I thought were really funny, so I'm really happy to address them here because I've kind of been waiting to talk about this. I got a ton of comments that's like, oh, you know, Canyon is the reason Gen.G struggled this year, which I just find to be such a funny thing to say when Gen.G didn't struggle this year. Like, how can Canyon be the player that caused Gen.G to struggle when they didn't struggle? Like, where is the struggle? Is it in the room with us right now? This team was dominant throughout all of 2025. They went undefeated. They didn't basically go undefeated. They went undefeated in the spring split, at least in terms of series score. And then, you know, in summer, while they dropped, you know, a series to KT Rolster into T1 at the beginning of the split, like, they were basically perfect. They dropped 2 series in the summer split. If you want to sit here and say that Canyon wasn't perfect, I agree with you. Canyon has always been a player who's had his ups and downs and who's been a bit more inconsistent than maybe you'll get out of the top tier junglers, you know, in the LCK, or at least your idea of the top tier junglers in the LCK, but no jungler was perfect last year in 2025. There were a lot of up and down moments for basically everyone. I think Canyon had just as good of an argument as anybody did for being the best jungler in the world in 2025, and I think, ironically enough, Gen.G's success kind of overshadowed him as a player. This team was so good that the fact that he was making any mistakes at all when Chovy, Ruler, Duro, Keen, they weren't making any mistakes, kind of led people to believe that he was overhyped and overrated. If he had the exact same year that he had on Top Esports or Hanwha Life or, you know, whatever other, you know, team that had a really good Anyone's Legend, if he had literally the exact same year, played the exact same way that he did on Gen.G, people would be lauding him as an underrated player. But because he was on a team where basically everybody was perfect and he was the only one who had any sort of inconsistency, it just kind of stood out to people more. I don't think there's anything on tape that would indicate that Canyon is going to fall off in 2026. Maybe he does. He's always been an inconsistent player, and I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's versatile or that he's a, you know, perfect player by any stretch. He's not really that great of a tank player. He's gotten better at that over the course of his career, but he kind of needs to play carries. It's just, I think we nitpick Canyon so hard because he's on the best team in the world, and you're just kind of hoping and praying that, you know, he can kind of step up that consistency, and you're hoping and praying that he can be that clear-cut #1 jungler, and I just don't think he's been that. But he's been in the conversation. A-, I think, is a very fair grade for someone of Canyon's caliber. But those are kind of the controversial players out of the way. We can get to the rest of the roster now. We'll talk about the bot lane next because I think they're kind of the core here. Duro, the first player re-signed after Chovy for 2026. It's clear that Gen.G hit when they ended up bringing him in. Great take for the channel a couple of years ago when Duro was an all-pro for me after only playing like 8 games for BNK FearX. I really thought he was that good, and then the next year he gets picked up by Gen.G. Now he's arguably the best support in the world. This guy's awesome. He does everything at an elite level. He is a very, very good game controller in terms of being able to play out the mid game, and he pushes a lot of Gen.G's advantages forward when they're able to generate it on their own in laning phase. I think he's a perfect fit stylistically for both Ruler and for this team as a whole, for Canyon in particular as a jungler, and I think he was awesome. He got better basically every single game last year. I think he is a better prospect than Delight was when they brought Delight in, even if I think Delight might be like equally as good of a player now. I expect Duro to be better than Delight by the end of this year. If he's an A+ kind of player, like competing with KIA for best support in the world, I don't think a lot of people are going to be surprised. Ruler gets an A grade for me. I don't really care. Like, this guy had some bad performances at Worlds. I think, you know, Chovy was pretty terrible in game number 3 of that semifinals and rightfully got called out. I don't think enough people are calling out Ruler for just how awful he was in game 4 that ended up getting them eliminated from that world championship. He basically single-handedly lost that game, but I'm sorry, I'm not taking one game over, 10 months of film. Ruler is the best AD carry in the world at the moment, and I think it's close, but I don't think it's like crazy close. Ruler is just kind of that guy. He continues to be a mid-game dominator. He is the best mid-game AD carry of all time in terms of being able to take a small gold lead and turn it into a massive one. His skirmish potential in 3v3s around, smaller objectives like Dragon or like Rift Herald, it's just better than almost anybody else in the world. I think the only thing that you can consider a negative for Gen.G is that there's no more Otacon for Ruler to be able to dominate fights at, because he was really good in that phase of the game, but he's still a phenomenal team fighter. He can be a really effective laner if you draft for that. He's kind of an all-arounder, in my opinion, the greatest AD carry of all time. Obviously, I think he's an asset to this team. I don't think a lot of people are going to be arguing that. And then there's Keen on the top side. Talk about like the pinnacle of consistency. There are times where this guy can pop off and look like one of the better players in the world, but oftentimes he's not asked to do that, so he just kind of sits on top side and plays weak side at a really high level. He's a perfect top laner for this team because of just how selfless he is, how much he learned to kind of take a back seat on those Africa teams from many years ago. And, I think he complements what especially players like Canyon and Duro do at a very high level because, again, he can carry. You can invest into him, and he will dominate lane matchups if you give him counterpick, but he doesn't really need to do that in order to be a really effective and arguably the most valuable top laner in the world. So for Gen.G, there's really no notes, right? Like, this team was the best team in the world last year until the semifinals of Worlds, and they just couldn't quite get past that barrier. You should run it back. There is absolutely no reason to make changes here. Obviously, you can talk about the Worlds yips or the struggles all you want. That's a completely different discussion. That's a different video entirely, but in terms of LCK ranking, there is no reason to believe that Gen.G should be anything other than the best team in the LCK again in 2026. But then moving on to our second team of the video, and of course that was our second seed from the LCK last year, Hanwha Life Esports. And you want to talk about a team that, I don't want to say won the offseason, because I think that there are a lot of teams that have the argument for winning the offseason. Hell, Gen.G could have won the offseason by retaining everybody. T1 certainly has an argument that we will get to in just a little bit, but Hanwha Life just really kind of changed their roster up in a way that I think makes them better. I think they will be a better team going into 2026, and they were already a ridiculously good team in 2025. They won an international tournament at, in First Stand. I know people kind of overlook First Stand, but like, they were international champions in 2025, and it feels like we've all just kind of let that fall to the wayside. They might even be better this year. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup for 2026 is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Gumayusi at AD carry, and Delight at support. Some of the changes they made were ones they wanted to make, clearly, wanted to move into a different direction. Some were, kind of forced upon them. Obviously, Peanut having to retire for his mandatory military service over in Korea. Very sad. We miss you already, Peanut. One of my favorite players of all time. I've been very vocal about that. But even someone like Viper going to the LPL, I don't know if that was a part of Hanwha Life's calculations, if this team was always going to be looking for a new AD carry. It did seem like that was the direction they wanted to go in. I'm sure that once they heard that Gumayusi was available, they were pretty quick to jump onto that, and we'll talk about the new players in just a little bit, but I want to talk about the retentions first. I think two of them make a ton of sense. I think all three of them make a ton of sense, quite frankly, but, we're going to talk about Zeus and Delight, who I think were pillars for this team last year. Zeus was incredible for most of the year, especially in winter and spring, where it really felt like he was on like an MVP trajectory, through the spring split, and I know that obviously the LCK last year just did like full year awards rather than, spring MVP and summer MVP or whatever. Through the spring split, he was second in MVP voting for me, only behind Chovy. I really do think he was that good for HLE and that valuable for the team. Basically every single game that they were winning, they were playing through the top side. It became really kind of a meme for me on this channel that it was like, you have all this talent on this team and yet you want to play for top lane, like the lane that usually gets the least amount of resources, because, Zeka's been inconsistent and Viper's actually really good as a weak side ADC. It allows Delight to move around a bit more. Peanut gets to be a bit more passive in the early game so that he can play for mid-game fights. It kind of just played into the skill set of every HLE player, and Zeus was capitalizing on that. I wish he stayed as consistent towards the end of the year, because it really did feel like a lot of those awesome games ended up falling off at least a little bit towards the end of summer. He was still very good, just maybe not quite the MVP caliber player, like the best top laner in the world, as I was calling him, kind of player for most of the year. Keen very much overtook him, I think, in the summer split, but he's still very much in that conversation. Him and Keen have the same grade for me, both in an A-, in terms of where they are at. Zeus at any point can perform like an A or an A+. He is the player that I usually get the most amount of comments, grilling me. It's really funny. A couple of years ago, if you go back to the 2023 version, or maybe it's 2024, one of those 2 years, that version of this video, all you're going to see in the comment section is people yelling at me for putting Zeus as an A- instead of an A or an A+. This was coming off of his World Finals MVP, so it must have been the 2024 version of this video. And I was like, yeah, he's very good. He's in contention for being the best top laner in the world, but everybody kind of just wants to crown him that because he won Worlds. And the player that I kind of named at the time was Bin, who I thought was a little bit better than him. That aged really well. Hopefully Zeus can kind of, reassert himself, but he's like very much consistently been the second best top laner in the world, regardless of who the best top laner in the world is. It's been very funny. So he's great. I mean, obviously you're very rarely going to be able to upgrade from a player of this caliber. And then there's Delight in the support position, who I think is coming off the best year of his career. I know that might not be the most popular opinion in the world, but oh my goodness, this guy really showed a ton last year. He was awesome to watch. He was the best support in the world, I think, through the first 4 months. KIA, obviously, I think, really stepped it up down the stretch. Him and Gumayushi really found their form once Guma came back into the starting lineup towards the end of spring. But before that, Delight was incredible and really was kind of driving most of what HLE was doing in terms of their proactivity. I think Delight has become everything that anybody could have imagined for him as a prospect, and HLE are going to be happy to keep him around. He's a great engager. He's a really good playmaker if you want to get him, moving around the map in the early game. He's just really proactive. He affects the game very heavily. He doesn't need to play 2v2, but he can play 2v2 if he needs to. I think this is just a really great player, and I think HLE are happy to be able to retain him. And then Zeka is the final player returning here, and Zeka is a much more interesting conversation in terms of just where he is at, because I think going into last year, he was pretty clearly the second best mid laner in the LCK, only behind Chovy. I think he had really proven time after time that he was just really good at every phase of the game. I think people continued to criticize him for having a limited champion pool, and yet he would go out on the champions that he wasn't very good at and, be able to pull off 15 kill games where he carried his team. Like, if that's what you look like on your bad champions, then yeah, sign me up, man. Like, Zeka had just proven to me that the consistency was there, that the killer instinct was there, the ability to lead a team was there, and I thought he was just going to be the best, one of the best mid laners in the world, one of the best players in the world for a good time, going. And for the most part, at the beginning of last year, again, we saw that. We saw in winter and in spring that this guy was, firing on all cylinders. And then whatever happened in that series against Gen.G to qualify for MSI, it just broke him mentally. Like, they were up 2-0, they get reverse swept in that series. He basically runs down all 3 of those games and then gets completely obliterated by Faker and by T1 to miss out on MSI after being heavy favorites to go basically the entirety of the spring split. And again, he just never recovered from that. He never once throughout the rest of the summer split looked like a elite level player again. And that's why he gets the B+ grade for me, is I need to see this guy get back into the A column in terms of how he actually played, because I'm very worried that mentally he just got destroyed from whatever happened in those 2 series, that he kind of started to doubt himself a little bit more than maybe he had in the past, and that, he just was not able to recover. Because I can't stress enough just the stark difference between the way that this guy played in May versus the way he played in October. Like, it was not, even close to the same player. So hopeful for Zeka. Again, another player who's been a channel darling, really the first channel darling that this channel had back in the DRX days in 2022, even the BLG days in like 2021. Always been really high on Zeka, so hopefully he can rebound. And then you've got 2 new additions. We'll start in the bot lane here with Gumayushi as the AD carry. This kind of felt like a no-brainer once Viper was gone. This felt like the obvious fit for Guma. Not only has HLE kind of become the landing spot for talented players that other top-tier teams have gotten rid of, like Zeus and like Delight from their individual team, Zeus as well from T1, but Guma is just, he's in peak form right now. I don't think Guma has ever played better than he is right now, or at least than he was at the end of the year. I kind of called my shot on the Guma Finals MVP before World Finals, and that ended up coming to fruition. Even if I don't agree with it, I absolutely think that Owner should have been Finals MVP. Not that I think it was like egregious. I think Guma was great, but Owner I thought was really excellent in the finals, at least in their wins in games 4 and 5. But Gumayushi, I mean, I've gone on and on about how I think somehow, some way, a T1 player has become the most underrated player in the world. He was the best player on T1 for the most part this past year, and I don't know if he ever really gets that kind of credit. His stability, the ability to do really anything, the flexibility of his games, his play style, his game plan, whatever you want to, kind of verbalize that as, he's awesome to have. He's listed as a change here from Viper because Viper is also an elite level player who basically does everything at a high end level, and I would even argue that Viper might be a little bit more consistent as a carry. Would I put Gumayushi above Viper? I don't know. I guess we'll never have to know. I think they basically have identical grades for me. This is basically a side grade. I think you're going from one of the best AD carries in the world to another one of the best AD carries in the world. And I think, that's just a luxury that many teams don't have the opportunity to have. I think they're happy to be able to pick up Gumayusi, a player who for the most part last year was an A-graded player rather than an A-. I just don't quite know if I feel comfortable that he's definitely going to be that again now that he's out of the T1 system going into 2026. And then the final player here is going to be Kanavi coming into the jungle. I'm super excited about this, and this might be a bit of a controversial take, but I don't think there is any question. Kanavi was better than Peanut last year. Like, there is no, like, the Kanavi from 2025 is better than the Peanut from 2025. Not that Peanut was terrible, he just was, like, fine. He was a slightly above average jungler, and at times was somebody who was really limiting the upside of what HLE could accomplish. Kanavi was dominating the LPL. This guy was pretty clearly, 1A, 1B, with Knight for the best player in the LPL in 2025. And you want to talk about the LPL being a bit weaker, I can kind of understand where you're coming from there. I had even pushed that narrative for a lot of last year, but Kanavi was the exception to that. I think HLE being able to bring him back to the LCK or bring him to the LCK for the first time ever. This guy's never played in Tier 1 in Korea. He went over to China and the LPL before he ever played a Tier 1 game. For him to be making his LCK debut now for HLE, I think it's a big win for this team. He's really aggressive, but in a way that I think controls game states better than almost any other jungler in the world. He is still, for my money, the best early game jungler in the world, and it's not particularly close. You want to talk about generating resources both for himself and for his laners. There is nobody who does that at a more efficient clip than Kanavi. He understands matchups. He's a great skirmisher. He can sometimes get a little bit lost in the weeds if he's neutral in the early game, where he tries to make some over-aggressive plays in the mid game. That's really been the only thing he's consistently been taken advantage of, but he's awesome. Like, you want to talk about getting the best early game jungler in the world and, replacing Peanut, who is kind of the opposite style of that, a slower paced jungler who wants to play a little bit more for stability in team fights and try to get his laners ahead. Kanavi obviously coming in is going to increase the pace of this team quite a bit. I think that is to the benefit of a lot of these HLE players. Zeka prefers to play fast. I think someone like Delight could really function at a crazy high level if he gets to skirmish even more in the mid game. Gumayusi, of course, is good enough to do that. Zeus is, of course, good enough to do that. So I think Kanavi is a better fit for the team stylistically, and I think he was better last year. This is an upgrade for me in the jungle, and I think HLE, one of the few teams in the world that genuinely got better, I think, going into 2026. I think this team is going to look and feel very different because I think Peanut had such a specific playstyle for how he wanted to play in the jungle, and Viper obviously was a very centralizing player. But if Zeka can get back to the form he was at throughout most of the past couple of years rather than what he was in summer, and Guma comes in and is everything he was last year, and Kanavi comes in and is everything he was last year, this could be the best team in the world. Like, that's the kind of upside that HLE have, and to lose out on your jungler and your AD carry, two of the best players in the world, and to somehow have that sentence be true, like still be one of the best teams in the world going into 2026, basically upgrading or side grading at the very worst going into the next year, it's a miraculous offseason for this team. But then moving on to our third team of the video and the surprise darlings of Worlds this past year, a team that was one game away from being your world champions. It's KT Rolster. And they made some changes this offseason. I think that that's fair to say in terms of what their roster is looking like in comparison to maybe what the expectations were for this team. I'm okay with them making changes. It really did feel like they overperformed a ton and they wanted to try and capitalize on the fact that, yeah, it turns out BDD is like one of the best players in the world. He's an A-graded player. He's not quite an A+ because he's not somebody that's going to just win the LCK every single year, basically no matter what, but he's pretty darn close. He's a top 5 player in the world, that kind of performance. You want to try and build around that. When you have that available to you, when BDD is in such good form like he has been the past couple of years, you want to capitalize on it. I don't know if they're doing that, man. Like, I understand wanting a new bot lane. In fact, I would even have pushed for a new AD carry. Maybe I would have kept Peter around because I do think Peter has a really good amount of upside, and I think he could turn into one of the better supports in the entire world, but I get wanting to switch out AD carry. Hell, I would have understood if you wanted to switch out top lane. Even though Perfect was awesome at Worlds, he was inconsistent domestically. I'm a big fan of Perfect, which we'll talk about, but this is just not the answer for me. I think this is a very, very weird offseason for KT, and I'm really not the biggest fan of it. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Perfect in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Ghost or Polu at support. Both of them are on the roster. I'm going to talk about both. It does look like Ghost was kind of brought in to be the starting support for this team, which is a very interesting thing to end up breaking down for them. But again, we will talk about that a bit more at the end of this segment. We talk about the retentions first. How can you start a conversation about KT Rolster without speaking about BDD first and foremost? I think I've already kind of gone over my thoughts on BDD and where I think he's, landed as a player. He's an A-graded player. He's arguably the second most valuable player in the LCK. I think you could make that, conversation happen. I think it's either him, it's Ruler, I think, in that conversation. I think it's Keria in that conversation. Like, those are the players that, BDD is rubbing rubbing shoulders with at this point in terms of, where he is at. I think he just had the best year of his entire career. I think he just dragged a KT Rolster team that was nowhere near good enough to be a World Finals contender into being a World Finals team. And you want to build around him. You want him to be not only the face of your franchise, but you want to be able to say, okay, if you have a player like BDD, you should be going to World Finals every single year. Like you know what I mean? Like you can't be a team that has that kind of talent and not be at least aiming to be in that area. Pun entirely not intended for that segment, but I don't know if they did enough around BDD to actually accentuate his strengths as a player. What he's good at, in my opinion, is kind of that slower style. He is a mid laner from, I don't want to say a bygone era, but it's clear he debuted in 2016, 2017, because he is much more, faker than he is like Zeka in terms of his playstyle. He can be really good on assassins, but this guy is definitely much more of somebody that wants to play control mages, that wants to be a bit more, lane focused and to generate leads on his own and then play, 5v5 team fights towards the back half of the game. And while I think that is a decently successful style, and while I think players like Aiming do fit that identity, even Cuz I think really kind of complements that identity well, I don't know if you are surrounding him with players that I would expect to just be mechanically better than everybody else, which is kind of the idea behind that, player, that style. You want players that have ridiculously good hands, even if they have weaknesses elsewhere. Just not sure you brought that in for KT Rolster, but, retaining the top side as well. Cuz is coming back. I've been decently harsh on Cuz during this channel's history, not because I hate him. In fact, I quite like Cuz. I just do think he is like a tier down from the best junglers in the world, which I'm not sure is, against the grain. I feel like most people are probably about where I'm at with Cuz right now, where he's like the definition of a B+ player. You feel really good about him as your starting jungler going into a year, but I don't know if this guy's ever going to win MVP. Like, I don't know if he's ever going to be consistent in that regard. He was terrible at the start of the year for KT when this team was a disaster. I can't stress enough, KT was awful in the spring split and really looked like a team that not only was not going to be going to Worlds, but was a team that looked like for most of that split, they were going to be in the Rise group. Like down, DK was going to be kind of taking their spot in that top 5. But again, a big surge once Peter came in as the starting support, ended up really salvaging their spring split, got them into Legend group, and of course got them to Worlds eventually. Cuz was terrible until Peter came in. And I'm not going to say him and Peter were like, perfect together. They had great chemistry and it's clear they played off of each other well. But one of the things that Cuz really needs to do is generate resources early. I've always kind of called Cuz baby Kanavi. That feels really disrespectful. Like baby anyone feels like I'm, trying to patronize Cuz, who just went to World Finals and was really good throughout basically all of the World Championships, was a really great player, was better than Kanavi at Worlds, so how can I call him that? I think it's fair to say he is Kanavi, right? Like he is like 95% of what Kanavi is. I think he struggles a bit more from losing game states, and he's a bit more feast or famine than someone like Kanavi is, but that kind of play style where he does want to generate leads early. He's one of the best early game junglers of all time, and I think that's really good as a compliment to BDD, because BDD is so dominant in lane that you don't really need to give resources to him. He can just kind of stay isolated in the 1v1 matchup and be able to generate resources for himself. So Cuz can actually be a bit more selfish in the way he plays the early game and still not really feel any sort of negative effects from it. We've seen him struggle on other teams in the past when he has to babysit certain lanes. And then there's Perfect on the top side. Perfect's good. Like, I'm so happy to see that he had such a good World Championships, because I've been on the Perfect train since the Challengers League. I was really going to bat for this guy. I said some things there that I don't know have aged all that well. It's kind of up to your debate. I guess he was in World Finals and these other players weren't, but like I was looking at, Thanatos and Shiwu and all these other Challengers League top laners that were getting so much, press and coverage, and I was like, I think Perfect's better than them. I think he had a higher floor at the time and certainly was a better player in the Challengers League than those players were. I don't know if that's translated well. I guess it's all up to how much you want to interpret Thanatos dominating North America, but Perfect getting to World Finals, like, I'm not all that surprised by the way that this guy was, playing as a prospect. Do I think it's always been there in the LCK? No, but do I think this guy has gotten significantly more hate than maybe, a regular player would at his position? Definitely. I think he's criticized a lot more, and I'm really not sure why. I think KT Rolster fans just have high expectations for what they want out of their team. But Perfect is a really solid player, somebody who you're going to feel really good about. On the top side, he's not a superstar, but he's like a B+ caliber top laner, and I don't think you can really be all that frustrated with it. I agree with retaining him. Where things start to get off the rails for me is Aiming and Ghost in the bot lane. I just don't really get this move. Like, I understand moving on from Duckdom. I don't even think it was the wrong decision. I think you have to kind of treat his amazing World Championships with a grain of salt, because he's never really been that consistent of a star caliber AD carry. He was really good when this team was effective, but he's kind of the kind of player who's going to just play however the rest of the team is playing. He's not going to be able to salvage a game state that's not particularly good. He's going to look good if the team is playing well. That's always been Duckdom's thing, jack of all trades, master of none. Aiming is not a jack of all trades. He is a very specialized player, but he's also not a game breaker. Like he's not an elevator. He's not somebody who goes to teams and makes them better by being on those teams. He is like the definition of a B graded player for me. Somebody who is fine. Like he deserves to be in the league. He's a starting caliber player, but you want to try and convince me he's a top 380 carry. You're just not going to be able to make that argument to me. I don't think he's that kind of player. He is, again, spec'd very specifically in terms of how he plays the game, and maybe that does play into the reason they wanted to bring him back here to KT, because he's a bad laner. He's one of the worst laners at the AD carry position in the LCK, but he's one of the best team fighters. He's just really good in the late game and in the 5v5s. He's very consistent at being able to generate, good game states for himself. He's kind of a KDA monster and a stats monster, as I always like to call him. He's a stats merchant, if you will, where it feels like he kind of just plays really slow and safe for a majority of the early game and then just takes over in DPM because he doesn't really have to do anything all that spectacular. Like, he's a good player. He's valuable to have, but, like, is this the kind of player that you want to be having if you want to compete to even make, like, the semifinals of Worlds again? Probably not. Like, Aiming's just not that kind of caliber. He's nowhere near the top 20 to 25 players in the world, and for an AD carry, you kind of want that. Like, I don't think this is an upgrade in the bot lane. I have this considered a change. I have Doctum and Aiming with the same grade. I think they're similar players. I think Aiming is better, but I think it's marginal, right? Like, I don't think it's enough to really separate them in terms of a grade score, and I think you could have done better. There had to be better options out there and available. I'm shocked that this team wasn't like throwing everything at Viper to try and get him to come over here. Obviously, he probably just wanted to go to BLG to compete for a world championship, but BDD had to be a pretty big selling point as well. Like, I don't know. Aiming just doesn't really feel like the answer. I mentioned Viper, but what about Hype? Like, where is Hype? I get that he wasn't, I wasn't singing his praises on Bro. I think he was inconsistent, but he had good games, and at least Hype gives you, like, some kind of upside. Aiming just feels like a, medium floor, low ceiling, and that's, like, a terrible combination. This is the kind of signing that I think, like, a DN Freecs would have made, and we'll talk about them, obviously. It's a very funny comparison to make, but, safe to say I'm not high on the Aiming signing, and quite frankly, I'm not high on the support situation here either. I have Ghost listed here. Polu is on this team. I think Polu has less upside than Ghost, and so I'm going to list Ghost here. I would give Ghost a B-. I'd give Polu like a C+ in terms of their grades, so I'm listing Ghost because I think it's better, but both of them are downgrades from Peter. Peter was absolutely a valuable piece to this team last year. I think it's pretty clear that he was the third best player on KT Rolster last year. I don't really think there's any sort of argument against that. I've always been a big fan of Peter's game. I think he's a great playmaker. If you want to get him on Nico or Bard or, a lot of these things that, players like Keria or even like Busio over in the LEC now, like, they get a lot of credit for being playmakers. Peter's really great on those champions. He's very much kind of in that Keria mold, not nearly as good of a player, but, built like that kind of player. He can play engage tanks as well. The Nautilus has always been a pretty spectacular pick of his, but, he just understands the game. Like, he gets where he needs to be at any given moment. He doesn't really make any sort of mental errors. He's very stable. It seems like he had great chemistry with Cuz. I don't really get moving on from Peter. He really saved your year, and especially I don't get moving on from Peter to bring in Ghost, and I'll make it clear here. I don't hate Ghost as a player. This guy's coming back, obviously, from a stint in Latin America where he was competing, in Tier 2 to try and make Tier 1 over in North America, and it didn't end up working out for him as an AD carry because, of course, he's known as an AD carry. I've seen some people online being like, how can we judge Ghost? So, like, how can we call this a bad roster move? We don't even know if Ghost is good as a support. That's why it's a bad roster move, right? Because maybe there is a world where Ghost is a really good support. I think that's totally possible. Playstyle-wise, I understand why there is an excitement around Ghost role swapping to support. He is like the premier example for weak side AD carry, winning worlds with Dplus KIA, or with Damwon, sorry, not Dplus KIA, winning worlds with Damwon as, like the best weak side AD carry and being super low resource and having good macro, all of that stuff. But like, there's so much more to support than just those things, first and foremost. And also, like, I get it. You want to take a punt on Ghost? I think that would have been an awesome punt for a team like Bro or, DNF or whatever, a team that kind of is in rebuild mode and has the luxury of being able to, try and take a punt on a player that might be good and might not be good. You have BDD and Cuz on this roster, and you're bringing in someone who's never played this position before at a professional level to start. This team should not be taking punts on players to hope and pray they're going to be good in those roles. This team should be going out and getting the best players in the world with their core. The fact that they're not doing that has to be considered a bad off-season move. This is a downgrade no matter what. I think Peter is a better player than both Ghost and Polu. If Ghost is better than Peter year one, I think that would be a pretty high percentile outcome. Like, I don't think that's likely. I think Peter is likely a better player, at least in terms of, where his raw skill set is at. And I think Ghost is going to have his learning curve. I don't think Aiming is the perfect bot lane partner to help you learn support, because Aiming is so passive and so anti-2v2 down on the bot side that Ghost is basically going to get thrown into the deep end early. He's going to have to be a proactive playmaker for this team, because every support that plays with Aiming has to do that with his playstyle. I just think this is a bad move. Again, I'm not trying to criticize Ghost or, him as a player. I don't think he's in the kind of form that people want him to be in right now. But again, this idea of defense where it's like, well, Ghost could be really good. This team doesn't need a could be really good kind of support. They need somebody who is good right now, and I don't think they got that. I think KT clearly got worse this offseason in terms of just where their floor is at, because I think this team is, their floor is nowhere. I mean, Ghost could be terrible, and I think Perfect has, a lot of signs where he could be, the 4th or 5th best top laner, but maybe not the best, and Aiming is certainly not someone who can elevate the team. I think you took a team that was carried by BDD and made him have to carry it even more. I'm really just not a fan of this offseason. They could still be good enough to be, top 3, top 4. I think BDD really is that strong. Cuz is also, a good player, but if they're going to do it, it's going to once again have to be off the back of superhuman performances from your stars, and I guess I just wish they had more support here. But then moving on to our 4th team of the video, and it's our defending world champions. It's somehow a team that we're talking about almost halfway through the video, yet they're always winning worlds. It's T1. You don't really need some sort of introduction for this team. If you're watching this video, you know who T1 is, you know what they're about, you know what their expectations are going into any given year. These are the back-to-back-to-back, the first ever 3-peat world champions in League of Legends history, and they are making a change. It's certainly a big one. I think it's an identity change, but this is T1 at its most T1. This is them looking at their roster saying, we've got a lot of great players. We can shuffle anyone in and out, and we're going to be able to make it work because the core that we have built is just so strong. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Doran in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Pays now at AD carry, and KIA at support. There is a lot to talk about in terms of the T1, players here, but I've gone on and on about most of these guys in terms of why their grades are what they are. I'll give some specific examples of exactly what I'm talking about in this particular instance, but we're going to talk about the best player on T1 first, and at this point, there's no argument for anyone, at least in my opinion. It's KIA. In the support position, this is now, he's now clearly the greatest support of all time. I think he is a top 5 player of all time on like the GOAT list or whatever you want to put it as. Like he has been the best player during this era of T1's dominance. And, you want to talk about, players like Zeus getting finals MVP or Faker and Guma getting finals MVP. That's great. KIA has been like the rock for what T1 has been doing the past couple of years. And, I think there's no one more deserving of the only A grade on this team than KIA. I think at this point, there's just not a ton to argue. He really found his footing in summer of last year. Again, there were some questions at the beginning of the year, but I think people overlook just how good Smash was coming in, and I think part of that has to do with Smash getting to play with KIA, right? Like, that's part of, maybe KIA's individual performances suffered a bit because of the extra responsibility he had playing with a rookie, but KIA was still excellent during that stage, and then Guma comes back in. It takes them a bit of time to get reacclimated towards playing the style that they had played throughout a majority of like 2024, because Guma and Smash are like polar opposite play style kind of players. Smash is a hyper carry, and Guma is somebody who wants to be a bit more versatile, a bit more, selfless, team-centric. KIA, I think, kind of struggled to get back into that playmaker role where he was a bit more of the carry in the bot lane rather than somebody who was, kind of facilitating what Smash was doing. But once they got locked in at the end of spring and, going into MSI, they never looked back. They are pretty much inarguably, a top 1 or 2 bot lane in the world. Like, I think you could say Gen.G was right there, and then, I wouldn't take anybody else, even HLE, who I thought was great. I think Guma and KIA were that good down the stretch. So, KIA being kind of the franchise player now for T1 makes a lot of sense. Faker is, of course, still here. He is the franchise player, but like, KIA, I think, is just kind of the identity of modern T1 for me. Faker is just, he's Faker, right? Like, is he an A- caliber player all year long? No, he definitely holds back some of his power for Worlds. That's very clear. He holds it back for international tournaments. He does the same thing at MSI as well, where he does step up and start to play a lot better than he does domestically. I think this A- grade is kind of an in-between. He's mostly an A-ish, like an A to A- player at international tournaments. He's probably like a B+ caliber player domestically for the most part. I think this is a fair enough grade for where Faker has ended up landing as a player in the past couple of years. I think it is a bit overlooked that Faker had his problems at Worlds this past year, mostly because I think the rest of the team was really good. I think Owner had a very good end to the tournament. I think Guma and KIA were unbelievably good at Worlds this past year. Faker's kind of deficiencies in certain series against Anyone's Legend, and then even in the finals against KT Rolster Rolster, I think they were hidden a bit more because, not that he was terrible, I'm not trying to make the argument that he was like awful in game losing, but I don't think he was like a perfect player at Worlds or anything. He got creamed by Chovy in the group stage, or in the Swiss stage, I should say. Like, there were some games that were like, you know, we're still waiting for Faker to power up and get into Faker mode. I think he eventually did get there, but, you know, he's Faker. Like, you know what you're going to get out of him. He's going to be inconsistent in the regular season, probably the 3rd to 4th best mid laner in the LCK, and then he's going to figure it out internationally when this team makes it because they're good enough elsewhere. And then you have Owner in the jungle. Owner has solidified himself as one of the best junglers in the world by this point. I think that there was a long time on this channel that I don't want to say anti-Owner, because that feels like that's much harsher than I think the reality of what the situation actually is. I wasn't anti-Owner. It was more so like, I saw how much Owner benefited from just having winning lane after winning lane every single game. You had Zeus on the top side, Faker in the mid lane, Guma and Keria. All 3 of his lanes were constantly winning, and his responsibility on those T1 teams in 2022 and 2023, they were just a lot lower than I think people were giving him credit for. He was asked to do a ton more in 2024. At times it looked bad, like when Poby came in, when Faker had to take a little bit of a break for his wrist, when, you know, Poby was kind of the starting mid laner for that team. Owner looked terrible. He looked unplayable in the jungle, and that's really where I was like, is this guy even like an elite level player? And then 2025 comes around, and he is, you know, pretty much the best jungler in the world for a majority of the year. I think he was worse down the stretch in summer than people give him credit for, and I think the start to his World Championships was very inconsistent. I think he needed some time to rev up, but that Anyone's Legend series, Dr. Mundo game notwithstanding, and then especially like semifinals and finals of Worlds, he was incredible. Like, he was awesome for this team. I think he's more than earned the A- grade. He's just inconsistent. You know, if he were a little bit more consistent from a game-to-game perspective, he'd be an easy A. His best games are A+, A caliber. He's just not consistent on a game-to-game basis. You don't really know which version of Owner you're going to get on any given day, but, you know, A- is not meant to be some sort of disrespect. He is an elite MVP caliber player on his best day. And then there's Doran in the top lane, the final returning member here. And Doran's an interesting case. I know a lot of T1 fans kind of wanted to see him go after 2025 and how he played at Worlds at times. I think the nerves definitely started to get to him in some of the big moments. We saw that in Game 5 of World Finals. That game was so out of control that it did not even matter. They were dominating it so much. But, you know, I understand why T1 fans are upset with Doran. There are very few upgrades. If you can't get like Zeus or Keen or Bin, Doran's probably the 4th best top laner in the world, and I know that doesn't feel like a good statement to say out loud, but it's kind of just the reality of where Doran is at and where top lane in general is at as a role right now. I think that role is super weak globally, not quite as weak as it was maybe in like 2022, but certainly like not nearly as deep as it has been in previous years. And I think Doran, for all of his faults, for the fact that he's not really that good of a laner, is not somebody who's ever really going to consistently generate a ton of leads 1v1 or be able to even survive in bad matchups, for all of the times where he greeds and over-aggresses in the mid game because he's not all that respectful with his pathing, like all of that stuff, he's maybe the best team fighter of any top laner in the world. Like, he really just is able to dominate games with 0 gold. It does not matter the kind of resources that he has. His positioning and his ability to find priority targets so efficiently, it's basically second to none. Doran has always been a player that I've defended a lot on this channel, and somehow, some way, I'm still having to do that even though he's on T1. You know, he's now a world champion. Hopefully the yips, the major international bugs, are kind of done. A lot of players, you know, Zeus, I think, is a great example of this, have those yips at the start of their career where they're just not quite as comfortable playing in the big moments. And then once they get it kind of off their chest, once they win that first big international tournament, Zeus with Worlds in 2023, like, they can kind of settle in and just become great international players. I'm hopeful that that can be where Doran is at now. He's kind of gotten the monkey off of his back. Hopefully he can just start playing like he does domestically, because, again, the team fighting, even if the laning isn't all that good, the team fighting is just so good that it almost doesn't matter. And then the new addition, Paze in the bot lane. I have been overwhelmed by the response that Paze has gotten on socials towards this signing, because I truly feel like I'm in some sort of Twilight Zone paradox, because so many people just have no clue who Paze is, and I just cannot fathom how that is even possible. Like, how are we even at the point? Do people not remember that this guy was on Gen.G for 2 years and that he was an MVP caliber player there? I get that not everybody watched the LPL last year, and, you know, even Paze's performance down the stretch in the LPL last year was not perfect, but mechanically speaking, I am going to say there might not be a better mechanical AD carry in the world. Like just from a raw technical perspective, like the basics of what you need to do to play that role at a professional level. I don't know if anyone has the basics down better than Paze, and he's like 19, 20 years old, first and foremost, and that's ridiculous. It's absurd, and he's already got the track record. He's been to the world semifinals multiple times. He was somebody who, you know, was carrying JDG for a majority of last year. This is not somebody who has been like, he's just been elevated by good teams throughout his career. player. Maybe you can make that argument for the start of his Gen.G tenure, but I dare you to go back and watch some of those Gen.G games, especially domestically, when he was playing with Chovy and when he was playing with Peanut. He was not getting carried in those games. He was my MVP in 2023 summer and in 2024 summer for the entirety of the LCK. I really do think he was that valuable. And for T1 to be able to bring this kind of talent in, like, I already know this guy's going to be a superstar for them. I'm not going to sit here and say it's an upgrade to Gumayusi, because Gumayusi is a better player, like a better all-around player. I will say, Paze is better mechanically than Gumayusi is. If you're, kind of just assuming that you can bring anybody into the T1 system and they're going to be able to replicate the kind of success that T1 normally has, they're going to be able to get that all-around game because it's kind of just what they do to everybody who ends up coming through here. Paze has a higher upside than Guma ever did, and that's not a slight on Guma. I think Paze has the kind of upside that, like, one of one AD carries end up having. He can be the best AD carry in the world without any question if you can just focus a lot of that talent into being a bit more consistent. It's really ridiculous that this team was allowed to go and pick him up. Like, obviously, losing Guma is not good, but Paze's upside on T1 with Keria, like, the upside of a Paze Keria bot lane is that they're up 500 CS every game. Like, obviously hyperbole, but, like, they're up, 50 CS every game, and Paze is the best hyper carry team fighter in the world, and this team can't be beat, right? Like, that's the kind of ceiling that this bot lane has with these two players, and you add Owner, who's having, like, the best time of his career right now, who's playing the best league of his career right now. You have Doran, who's also great in team fights. Faker, being somebody who can just stabilize in the mid lane. Like, that team can not only, like, win Worlds again, because obviously T1 can always win Worlds again. This could finally be the year where T1 is like, oh, are they favorites to win the LCK? I think Paze has that kind of upside. Now, he also has a floor. Like, he was not all that good at the end of the year last year. He was mostly good in summer, and this was a guy who was, like, the best AD carry in the LPL for most of last year, and so we're kind of, I guess pulling hairs at this point, but Paze will have some games where he's a bit more inconsistent because he's not all that aggressive in the early game. He's much more of a late game team fighter. But again, all I can see here with this move is the upside, and the upside is just ridiculous. I think that there is a chance that T1 is better in 2026 than they were in 2025. I think there's a chance that they're worse. There is a possibility for Paze to be worse than Guma. He's certainly more volatile, and I have to make that point clear. I'm not sitting here calling this an upgrade. It's why it's listed as a change and not as, an upgrade or anything like that. But the potential for this to be an upgrade is there, and if you're saying that about the back-to-back-to-back world champions, you're just in a ridiculously good spot. Then moving on to our fifth team of the video, and this fifth team is weird to talk about. They had a whole documentary in the offseason. The vibes on this team are rancid, but I kind of really love what they put together. It's Dplus KIA coming in, obviously fifth place, just narrowly missing out on a world spot last year. Not so narrowly. It was pretty clear that there was a top 4 in the LCK, and DK was very much on the outside of that. But for a Rise Group team, fifth place, not too bad. So let's go ahead and talk about what their offseason looks like, because honestly, I'm gonna be pretty strong in my opinion on DK. I really like this offseason. I'm really excited for this team going into 2026, and I'll kind of give my reasons why. Their lineup is looking like Shiwu in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, Smash at AD carry, and Career at support. You're retaining the top side, very similar here to KT, who we just talked about, but I think the circumstances are very different between those two teams. Ironically enough, I think the top sides are relatively even, outside of the fact that BDD is clearly better than Showmaker right now in terms of how they're playing, but that is no slight on Showmaker. I still think he is clearly the best player on this team, and somehow I think he's gotten into the camp where he is just underrated. There is no other way to say it. You go and watch him play in the Rise Group. Not only was he the MVP of the Rise Group, even over someone like Diablo, who I think was excellent. I think Showmaker was probably the best player in the Rise Group last year. But, like, he was one of the best players in the league, full stop. I get the competition level was lower. He got to play against the bad teams, whereas he never had to play against the best teams in the summer split. But this guy was awesome throughout basically all of the end of the year. He was really good when this team was genuinely phenomenal at the start of the year in winter, when they looked like they were one of the best teams in the entire world. Showmaker was on fire alongside Lucid. Like, I think B+ is just about as low as you can possibly go for someone like Showmaker. He's, like, near the top of a B+ for me. He's not an A- caliber player, but, like, do I feel better about someone like Showmaker than someone like Zeka going into 2026? Yeah, I kind of do right now. I really do think he's, consistently been put on this situation where his team around him has not been particularly consistent. He's not always playing with the best players at any given time, and yet, he's always treated as if he's the problem by DK fans because their expectations are just so high for Showmaker, who in his peak is one of the greatest mid laners of all time, right? Like 2020, 2021 Showmaker, there are very few players who can be, compared to that version of Showmaker, like, favorably in any way, shape, or form. So for someone like Showmaker, your expectations are just crazy. And, while he's not that superstar, like prime Showmaker anymore, he's still a very good player. Like, there are a lot of times that he's going to be better than someone like Zeka, that he's going to be better than someone like Faker domestically. And I just don't know if he necessarily gets that kind of credit. I think part of that is Lucid in the jungle. Lucid's a very tough player to try and grade. This is the antithesis of the grading scale. Like, the B+ is supposed to be the Bs that I feel really confident are going to be good, basically no matter what. I don't really feel that for Lucid, but like Lucid constantly oscillates from being an A- and a B like kind of player. So B+ is really the only grade that felt right to put him at. It really did not feel right to put him at a B, where he can be, significantly more inconsistent than basically every other B+. But when he is playing well, he's not a B+ player. He's an A-, like borderline A caliber player. That's what the best games from Lucid look like. He just has to do that more frequently because, man, I'm getting so tired of the inconsistency when it comes to him. The good games are just so good to watch, and he does it against top tier competition too. It's not like he's only beating bad teams. He looked really good against teams like Gen.G last year, and looked really good when he was playing against the other top teams in the Rise group in the summer stage. In the winter split, he was arguably the best player in the regular season if you count the LCK Cup. So it's just one of those things where it's like, I just need to see Lucid actually turn that potential into a reality, because at some point you have to say, okay, well, the potential is there, but like the actual execution is not. I get that this is only year 3, but this is a huge year 3 for Lucid. If he can turn into one of the best junglers in the world, which I think is very realistic for him, then I think DK is going to have a great year. And I think that the setup around him is the best it's ever been for DK this year. I think this is probably the best team he's ever played on in the LCK, at least from a, an excitement perspective. And if he is going to be able to turn into that star jungler, then yeah, I think this team's ceiling is a lot higher. You have Shiwu on the top side. I'm a pretty big defender of Shiwu. He's very similar to what we just talked about with Doran. I'm not going to say he's like the exact same player, but I do think that there's a lot of Doran in his game, and the fact that he's really not a good laner. He's not somebody who is all that talented at being able to play out 1v1s, especially if he's not given counterpick in draft, but he is an exceptionally good team fighter. There are so many games that he can turn things around just from one really nice play in a 5v5. There are very few top laners. Again, I think Doran is one of them, but very few top laners that consistently have the same kind of impact that Shiwu has in the later part of the game. And the problem with that is that it's really hard to quantify that, right? Because the laning stats are bad, the DPM really isn't all that good. Like, if you were just to look at him statistically, he doesn't match up favorably against a lot of the other top laners. But the eye test, I think, is very much there for his talent. I'm high on him, and that's kind of a risk that I'm taking, because I know not everybody is kind of in on Shiwu. I think he's going to have a really great year, and I'm hopeful that this is going to be a really strong year too for him. So I like the top side of the map here, and I love the additions on the bot side. This is kind of like the antithesis of KT Rolster, where they bring in 2 really high upside players that I think could really develop into, really big pieces. How can you not start with Smash and talk about Smash here? I really genuinely was like confident going into 2026 that Smash was going to be the future T180 carry, that he was going to be starting right now for T1. I didn't think they were going to get rid of both Guma and Smash and go and get Pays. I don't think that was a wrong decision from T1. I'm just kind of surprised. It really felt like they were grooming Smash to be the next 80 carry for T1 in the future, kind of like they did with Gumayushi many years ago, but they let him go, and DK is the team to swipe him up. Mechanically speaking, this guy is ridiculous, and I think the thing that impresses me the most is just how aggressive he is, how much he's willing to pull the trigger on the resources that he's generated. He could be a menace. Like, he could be an absolute monster at this level. This is a phenomenal pickup, truly one of the best additions in the offseason, in my opinion, just given the potential that he has as a player. You guys know I very rarely give B grades out to players who are not like established at the tier 1 level, who have not played at the very least like more than half of a year. Like, Smash got, what, 10 games or something? Something around there at the LCK level last year, and he got to play with a lot of really good teammates, but was never really fully integrated as the starter. I feel confident that Smash is going to be a valuable player at this level. The question is just how valuable is he going to be? And is he going to be that in year 1, essentially, for DK here? I just think the ceiling is ridiculous on this guy. He is a hyper carry player. Like, don't get it twisted. He is very much the guy who wants to pick Zeri and who wants to pick Jinx and wants to get all the resources and carry games, but DK's kind of really wanted that player for a long time. They've not had an AD carry that they can truly feel comfortable investing in quite a few years. You go from Doctum to aiming and like players like that. Deft even in the middle of that. Almost forgot about the Deft tenure. He was pretty good on this team, but definitely not that kind of player. Smash is much more greedy in the way that he wants to play the game, and that could make things even better for Showmaker and Lucid, who might have some of that carry potential taken off of their shoulders and given to another player. Again, I cannot stress enough. I think this is an upgrade over aiming, maybe not in the short term. This is listed as a change because there is a world where Smash isn't as good as aiming. He just has such a small sample size at the tier 1 level, and you can never be so sure, but I would bet that this is going to be an upgrade in the bot lane. I'd much rather have Smash right now than aiming in the bot lane. And then Career as the support here. Talk about another really good addition. I really loved the tape I saw from Career last year on the BNK youth team. I really don't think he's getting enough credit for how much of a playmaker he can be. Beryl was not good for this team last year. I gave him a B grade because he's Beryl and there's just nothing else to really say. B- is probably a lot more appropriate towards what Beryl actually was. I think it's highly likely that Career comes in and is better than what Beryl was for DK last year, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised if by the end of the year he was like a significant upgrade to this bot lane. I really do think that this bot lane 2v2 has the potential to just be a real problem for the league, but Career is not quite the same prospect in my opinion that Smash is. I think he's a great support prospect, but he's not somebody that I'm expecting to come in and completely dominate from day number 1. I don't think he has that same kind of floor that someone like Smash does. I just am kind of, I watch the tape and I just go, man, he does everything at a really solid level. He's a pretty well-rounded player. He's got the mental side kind of locked down. He doesn't really make a lot of mistakes. Again, lower level of competition, so it's really hard to give like a fair and accurate comparison, but I don't think that I think if Smash and Career were a top 3 to 4 bot lane in the LCK year 1, like that's not a shock to me. I think they have that kind of upside. It really would be, you know, the kind of bot lane that you could get really excited about if you're a DK fan, and I think for the first time in a couple of years for Dplus KIA, it genuinely feels like this team is invested like fully into the future. You brought up Lucid as a rookie, and then the year after you bring up Shiwu, and now you're bringing over Smash and Career, 2 young players that you can build around. You have successfully built a very young core here around your star player in Showmaker, and I love it. I think this is great process. I think whether or not they're actually a team that can go to Worlds in year 1 or anything like that, they're a team that feels like they can, and that's more than I can say about the veteran rosters of Dplus KIA over the past couple of years. I'm very excited for the direction this organization is going in, and honestly, I can't extend it more. I'm very happy about this offseason for them. Then moving on to our 6th and final playoff team from the summer split of last year. And technically, this is an international champion, a team that won ASI, the Asia Invitational, last year. It was BNK FearX, and they're not making any changes. This is the only other team besides Gen.G that is running back their entire roster from 2025. Part of that's good, part of that is very questionable. I think that there were some questions about whether or not this team could have upgraded in a lot of other areas, but I do think that for the most part, they still are a team with really high highs and really low lows, and it's going to be pretty easy to discuss them because there's almost no change in the conversation surrounding what they are this year versus what they were last year, and what they were last year was very defined. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is still looking like Clear in the top lane, a Raptor in the jungle, Vikla, I believe, in the mid lane. We'll talk about that in just a second. Diablo in the bot lane, and then Kellen at support. Vikla has the asterisk next to him, same thing with the no change there with the asterisk, because Daystar is here and he has kind of been included in every bit of promo packaging that I can see as a 6th man for FearX in terms of how they want to play this out. If Daystar ended up starting in the mid lane here, I would not be surprised. I think Daystar gives them a significantly higher upside in terms of what you can expect out of them in the mid lane, because Vikla is just such a feast or famine player who cannot really find any sort of like consistent form at any point in his entire career. But, you know, we're going to talk as if Vikla is still the starting mid laner here because he was the starting mid laner last year, and that's just what makes the most sense to me. I think Vikla will probably be starting day number 1, so we're going to talk about him as if he's the starter. But this team is very easy to discuss. This might be the shortest segment of the video because there's not really a ton to talk about. This is Diablo's team, and there's not really a ton of change in that. He is a B+ grade for me. I think he's looking like a potential superstar AD carry. I think that ADC is really the only role right now globally that feels like it has like a good selection of talent that didn't suffer a lot from the change in terms of like the Fearless rules last year, where a lot of players just got significantly more inconsistent from a game-to-game basis. AD carries feel like they're still in a pretty good spot, and Diablo, I think, is a great example of that. I think you can make the argument that he's a top 4-ish AD carry in the LCK. Like, he really is that good. He's the kind of player that can win you something like the Asia Invitational. Obviously, you know, not that ASI is the most prestigious tournament in the world, but, you know, it's the other international tournament around Worlds time. It's basically the Europa League to the Worlds' Champions League, and if Diablo is a good enough player where he can basically be the only star on a team team that ends up winning a tournament like that, that means he's a pretty darn good player. So you have to give him credit on that front. They beat Dplus KIA in the finals of that tournament, a team that, you know, most people would have considered better than them. I don't think anybody who watched the LCK last year would have said that they were definitely, you know, worse than Dplus KIA. They beat them multiple times in the regular season in the Rise group. Like, this team was genuinely very strong playing around Diablo, and he's got the mechanics of a psychopath. This guy reminds me of, the phrasing I used on him is going to be a little bit sad to maybe LEC fans, or maybe even like KT Rolster or Challengers fans or DRX fans or whatever, but I always describe Diablo as Paddock if he was good. Like, that's always kind of been the way that I've described, you know, Diablo as a player. He's crazy aggressive, and he's constantly going to be stepping up and, you know, looking to play hero ball, like in terms of the way he plays the game. But because he has a support like Kellen that's really good at being able to neutralize a lot of other factors, he can just use his mechanics to be better than a lot of the people he's playing into and be able to generate resources for himself. So they're happy to have Diablo. This is one of the worst grades that I had from last year. I didn't see it in the Challengers League. I just didn't. I didn't see the mechanical upside that he's clearly shown from day number one. It has been clear at the LCK level that this guy is a potential future star, and I'm excited to see him play again. I wish he had a better team around him, but, you know, it is what it is. Kellen is still a great support for him to have this early on in his career. Kellen continues to be one of the most underrated players in the world. He has been for basically his entire tenure in professional League of Legends. He gets blamed for so many things that are just not his fault in terms of how his teams end up playing. You want to talk about the macro aspect of it? Every single team he has played for has been, oh man, you know, we need to do better than Kellen macro-wise. And then they replace Kellen and their macro gets instantly worse. I think it was never more apparent than on Dplus KIA when they first did it with Bible a couple of years ago and they had to bring Kellen back for Worlds. And then when they replaced him for Moham at the end of a year and even going into Worlds, and they became the worst macro team at the World Championships without a doubt. Like, Kellen is clearly a macro stabilizer for so many teams, and his mechanics are fine. He's a good 2v2 player. He's not the most dynamic playmaker, you know, in terms of being able to find engage angles. You're not going to put him on Bard and expect him to completely destroy the game, but he is a solid enough player, and I think him and Diablo clearly have very good chemistry as a 2v2. Kellen is very, very smart in the way that he can direct the glass cannon that is Diablo on a lot of the opponents, and I think this duo is why you have any sort of confidence in BNK FearX, because both of them, I think, are good players that are good enough to go to Worlds on a better core. The problem is the rest of this team is just not at that level. I like Raptor as a player. He just is what it is. He is a feast or famine. He's either going to completely win you the game or completely lose you the game kind of jungler. He's kind of settled into being a little bit more stable than maybe he was at the beginning part of his career, but boy, is it not like stable. It's not consistent. You don't know what you're going to get on a game-to-game basis. His best games still look very good. His worst games look really bad. I think he found a bit of a middle ground, but it kind of took away some of his aggressiveness last year. I would rather him just be that feast or famine player, because at the very least, when it hits, like, this team can beat a lot of teams that are better than them. Raptor's just kind of a weird player to talk about. He's inherently going to have a ceiling because he just needs to play super aggro in order to find any sort of advantages, but when it works, it really works, and that's why he gets a B- grade. I'm happy that he still has a starting job here. I would have kept him as well if I were FearX. I think he has an inherent upside because of those good games if you can just bring that out a bit more consistently. It's the solo laners that you don't feel good about. Clear is probably a bit better than Vikla. It's not by a lot, though. Clear was benched midway through last year, and people just kind of forget about that. Sobero came in and was fine for the team, played weak side top lane, never really had to do anything, but for basically all of the beginning of last year, Clear was completely mentally checked out from this team. It was very clear even just watching the player cameras that he just was not locked in, he was not focused, let alone the gameplay that we saw in the Rift. It seemed like the benching did wake him up a bit. He was better in the summer split. I wouldn't say he was good, but he was better. He was like, you know, a lower tier LCK top laner rather than being the worst in the entire league, but it's hard to project this guy as anything other than like a bottom tier top laner at the LCK level, and that's frustrating here because I just don't think he ever has that kind of upside. And then there's Vikla in the mid lane, who for most of last year was maybe the worst player in the LCK. I will say, and I said this last year, he was better at the end of the year, and I don't think people are kind of talking about that. He really stabilized for this team. Not that he was like dominating or anything in summer. I wouldn't say he was good, but he wasn't losing this team games. It really felt like he kind of got his mental back and just started playing neutral in a lot of games, allowing the bot lane and the jungle to just be more aggressive, and that was a good role for him. But if that's best case scenario for your mid laner, like, that's so low upside that it's really hard to feel good or confident in him as a player. Daystar, like I said, gives you significantly more upside if he is going to be the starter here. I actually really like Daystar's take. tape, I think he could come in and actually be a pretty solid mid laner. I'd at least like to see him get a shot to prove that he can be an okay mid laner. I don't think he's all that different from Vikla day number 1. Maybe he's a little better, but I certainly think the upside is a lot more. I don't think Vikla's ever giving you a lot of upside, but I'll say this about Vikla. A lot of people will make him a C or a C-. I think they were right for most of last year. The reason he gets a C+ grade instead of a C grade for me is because he was at least solid enough in their playoff qualification when they, did get one of those top 6 spots, and then at ASI where he was fine. He was not a liability for that team. That's a C+ caliber player. But if that's the best version of Vikla that you're going to get, if it's never going to get better than a C+, it just feels like such a waste of time to bring him back and not to promote either internally or to find the bevy of other Challengers League mid laners that are good enough to get called up to the LCK. I just am a little bit frustrated by the lack of moves here because Diablo and Kalanissa bot lane is a very good duo and a very good core to build around, but once again, it kind of feels like this team is stagnating. I think they saw that they had success, they saw that they won an international tournament at the end of the year, and they think that they can just build upon that chemistry and continue to grow. I think we may have seen the best of what we can expect to see out of this team, especially as other teams around them in the league kind of get better, and I'm hopeful that that's not the case. Maybe Diablo even takes that next step and becomes like a true MVP candidate here. I'm kind of betting against that. I think this year might even be a little bit weaker than what their year was last year, and it was already a bit up and down for them. But then moving on to our 7th team of the video and our last Legend group team, which feels weird to be talking about so late, but they underperformed so much at the end of the year. They found themselves in 7th place. It was Nongshim RedForce, and they certainly looked at last year and went, we were close. We had Lehens, we had Kingin, and we brought in a bunch of veterans that, we tried to combine with some younger players that maybe had some upside, and it didn't quite work out. The younger players didn't really step up, and, they didn't become what we thought they would. So let's go ahead and bring in some other young players that have also had major concerns about their game and hope and pray that it goes better this time around, except let's get an extra veteran in the mid lane who just came off the worst year of his career. This is a very weird offseason for Nongshim if you can't tell. I'm not exactly sure whether I feel good about this team, but I certainly don't feel great about them. I don't feel like they've ascended into what they could be, which is an actual competitive team with players like Kingin and Lehens. They've more so just kind of stayed in the same spot that they were in last year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kingin in the top lane, Sponge in the jungle. I believe it's going to be Scout in the mid lane, Taeyun at AD carry, and Lehens at support. Again, there's an asterisk on the change and on Scout because Calyx is still here. He is very much still a part of this roster, but they brought Scout in. I presume Scout is going to be the starting mid laner. Once again, very similar to Kanavi. Scout finally gets a starting spot in the LCK for the first time ever. He only played a couple of games for SKT before he went over to the LPL, years and years and years ago. And so he finally actually gets to come home and play in Korea for the first time as like a real starter for this team. Unfortunately for him, it's not a great time in his career to be doing that. But again, we'll get to the changes after we talk about the retentions here first. Starting with Kingin and Lehens, really the only 2 retentions. I don't know why I would say it any other way. Lehens is kind of the face of the team in terms of how they're built right now. He's still very good, but man, is he volatile in terms of the way he plays. This reminded me so much of like the Freecs Lehens that we got many, many years ago, where he didn't necessarily have the superstar surrounding talent that he did on Griffin or on Gen.G or on KT Rolster even. And because of that, we saw him take a lot of risks that he couldn't necessarily back up in a lot of games. I think Lehens is still the same exact player he's been throughout the entirety of his career. He has leveled up his consistency at some phases, but clearly when he feels pressured to be the one that creates everything for the team, he's just going to fall into the trap of over pushing and actually just taking away resources from, what his AD carrier, what his jungler can actually gather throughout the early game because of his crazy pathing in the mid game. So, pluses and minuses to Lehens. I still think he's very valuable to have. He comes in as a B+ for me. He's likely going to perform worse than that throughout a majority of this year. There were times last year where he was still clearly the best support in the world, early on in the year before the mental just completely imploded on this Nongshim team because of the legend group thing. But we can't just pretend like he wasn't part of the problem at the end of the year, where his mental also completely imploded. Again, like, it's that middle ground that you want to try to find with the support, where they're going to get blamed for a lot of the bad things when the game state isn't in a very good spot, and they're also not going to always get, the most pushback when their team is doing well. Like, it's a role that requires your team to be in a good spot in order to look good. It's so hard to play from a losing spot out of support. So I wanted to try and give Lehens kind of a middle ground grade, and that, B+ kind of felt accurate to that. And I think the same thing kind of goes to Kingin on the top side. Another player who was looking excellent at the start of last year when things were, clicking for Nongshim. The reason that they were in the legend group was how well Kingin and Lehens were playing off of each other. But King and another player who just clearly kind of took a step back once things started to go bad in the summer split, once they, stopped winning anything. As a reminder, this team did not win a single series at the end of the year. They were, completely winless, and not in terms of games, but in terms of series in the Legend group, because they were only playing the 4 teams that ended up going to Worlds over and over again, and they just did not have the talent to be able to compete with that. Kingen, I think, is a fine enough player. He is kind of the definition of a B+ for me. I feel good about Kingen in the LCK, but he's never going to be like a star player. He's never going to be an A caliber player. He's just a really solid top laner to have, and I think even at times last year, he showed more than he had in the past couple of years on better teams. He just didn't really get the chance to actually express that because of, again, the fact that the rest of the team wasn't doing particularly well at the end of the year. But you are, kind of making some changes. I'll be honest, I don't really think this team has changed all that much. I think that there is some good and some bad here. The one bad change that I am going to call out first is Sponge coming in here in the jungle. And I hate calling this a bad change because Sponge is still a player that I think theoretically has upside. He was good in the Challengers League for DRX's Challengers team, and then he came up to those DRX teams that were a disaster and looked awful. Like, he was not year one, like 2024, Sponge was the worst player in the LCK. Taeyun, I think, had that for a little bit, but of course he only played a little bit of that year. Even so, he was really terrible, and we'll talk about Taeyun. I'm not feeling good about him coming back here, even if he was better last year, but Sponge is the kind of player that needed some development, got better last year, wasn't good, but wasn't terrible, was like a C+ caliber player, which is certainly an improvement over what he was in 2024, but I just don't feel great about bringing that in over Gideon. I don't know if you had Gideon under contract and you chose to go get Sponge instead, but I do think that Sponge is just a downgrade in terms of upside from Gideon. Gideon was a player who, while the consistency wasn't there, and again, he played a lot worse down the stretch, was really good when this team was firing on all cylinders and was showing a lot of really pleasing progress across multiple stops. He goes to the LPL for a bit, comes back and plays for Bro and looks okay for them, looks really good for Nongshim at the beginning of the year. It really did feel like Gideon was, kind of going on that development trajectory that would turn him into a solid starting jungler at this level. I don't really get replacing him with someone like Sponge, who has shown significantly less growth and development over the course of his career. This, to me, is just a downgrade. It's a downgrade in terms of potential, and it's a downgrade in terms of what they were last year as well. I don't like this move. Again, I don't know if they could have retained Gideon, who went over to Bro, and we'll talk about that, but if they had the opportunity to keep him and they didn't, that's a mistake. I think Sponge is not a player that I'm nearly as excited about. Again, maybe he turns into something good. I think that there is upside here. I'm not trying to sit here and pretend that he's a C-graded player or a C- graded player that doesn't deserve a spot here in the LCK at all, but, if he didn't have a team at the beginning of this year, nobody would have batted an eye. That I can definitely say, so we'll see how that turns out. And then you're bringing 2 players over from the LPL. We'll start with Taeyun. Again, the easier discussion here. Taeyun has such a funny career arc in terms of how things have broken down for him. He was a terrible AD carry in the LCK. He just, I cannot stress enough, and you can go back and, check this channel's history for my thoughts on Taeyun. I have never had a lower grade on a player than Taeyun's tenure in the LCK. I really don't think I've ever watched a player at a tier 1 level that was as bad as Taeyun was for the DN Freecs, for the Kwangdong Freecs at the time. He just was unplayable. There was no universe where he was a remotely playable player. He's the only player I've ever given a D grade to in these videos. He really was that bad in the LCK. He goes over to the LPL last year and plays for WE, and while there are still a lot of negative signs, he is way better than anybody could have ever expected him to be in the LPL. He's at least a passable AD carry, a slightly below average AD carry at that level, which is a huge, huge increase from anything that we saw from his time in the LCK. Now he's coming back to Nongshim, and they're hopeful that they're going to be able to get the good version of WE Taeyun out of him. I have a lot of reservations that is not going to happen. C+ is just about the highest grade that I feel comfortable giving him. Even towards the end of the year, he was starting to show that a lot of the flashes and the mirages of good play that we saw out of him in the spring split were not necessarily sustainable. But I will give him credit for something. He is reportedly a scrim monster. This guy is absolutely dominating scrims at every level against top-tier talent. If you can just get that talent out onto the stage more consistently, perhaps there's something there, but it's never been able to consistently be there for any team in any region. I don't like this pickup. I once again, I don't think Jiwoo is some sort of star. I think Jiwoo was worse last year than someone like Taeyun was, but I don't want to attach my future to Taeyun. I certainly don't want to give Lahens, one of the best supports in the world, Taeyun as his AD carry. It just kind of feels like a waste here. It's not a move I really like, even if I think this is going to be, classified as a side grade, a change. I wanted to see them upgrade in this position, and they just didn't really go out and do that. And then there's the mid lane, and mid lane is a tough conversation to have. First off, Calyx is still here. He is on the team. I don't know if he's going to be starting. Calyx was better than Scout last year. I don't think there's going to be a lot of conversation about that. Scout was awful. He played the worst year of his entire career for JD Gaming and was actively a reason why that team was I'll just say not competitive for a majority of the year, at least at the top end of the LPL, right? Like Scout was just not a good mid laner. He was constantly throwing away resources. He was really, kind of putting his team in bad spots. I think that there were moments where he was doing okay, but the lapses in mental were clear, and he would make the same mistakes over and over again, walking into the same part of the map at 12 minutes and dying over and over again. Teams clearly saw it on tape because they continued to kill him over and over again on that. He's got to be more consistent. For this to be the first time he's coming back to the LCK after the worst year of his career, this is a big leap for someone like Scout. I'm excited to see him in the LCK. He's one of the greatest mid laners of all time, a former World Finals MVP in terms of how he's broken down, a world champion, but like, he's not in the best form he's ever been in, and you're kind of asking him to be a big pillar of this team because, again, Lehens can only do so much, Kingham can only do so much on the top side. You need one of Sponge, Scout, or Taeyun to be genuinely very good, and I just don't know if any of them are going to be all that good. I don't like this offseason for Nongshim. I think they had a really great base. Building around Lehens and Kingan is a pretty easy job as long as you can get some relatively decent pieces, even some young pieces around him. Anybody with upside here. I would have loved if they kept Calyx, or at least started Calyx and then got new jungle and AD carry and, tried to play around that. But as it is right now, it feels like a team that took punts on young players that have shown basically nothing in terms of their floor, and then they brought in a super experienced and likely on the downturn of his career mid laner to, kind of help out this team. I would be shocked if they're better than they were last year. Maybe that still makes them competitive in like the top 5 to 6 range, but this team is nowhere near actually being like a relevant LCK team at the top of the standings, and with players like Kingan and Lehens, it's just a bit of a shame. Then moving on now to our 8th team of the video, and a team that I'm pretty used to kind of grilling in these videos year over year, basically no matter what change they end up making, because they almost always do things that I dislike, but last year was an exception, and this year I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. It's OK BRION, who was your 8th place team in summer of last year. A mix of young, up-and-coming, interesting pieces that I think have done really well in the Challengers League and have shown either, interesting, like, upside there or at the LCK level with someone like Gideon, obviously, that we will talk about, alongside players that I'm maybe not quite as excited about, maybe some veterans that I've been a little bit controversially low on in this channel's history, but I'm excited to kind of go over these individual pieces, and I'll kind of talk about where I think Bro ends up landing. I do think the organizational structure around Bro is significantly better than it was like 2 or 3 years ago, where they were constantly just bringing in washed veterans that were never really all that good to begin with. They were, washed and below average on LCK and LPL teams, and, they got brought in here with the expectation of like, oh, look at this, we signed the 8th or 9th best AD carry in the league. Like, oh, great. Like, I didn't feel great about that organization for a very long time. Last year, they finally invested into some young talent. It didn't really work out for them. Hambach really kind of was a miss in terms of how the LCK performance came down. Hype was good, but inconsistent in terms of how he performed, and then you had other veteran players like Morgan and Closer that were generally all right. Like, overall, I think their offseason was much better last year, but it really does feel like this organization continues to spin its wheels, and I don't think that really changed for me this offseason. Their lineup is looking like Casting in the top lane, Gideon in the jungle, Fisher in the mid lane, Teddy at AD carry, and Namgung at support. Obviously, I want to make this clear. I've said this multiple times in other videos as well. Oftentimes, I am watching so many games and so many leagues that I'll have to watch at 1.25 or 1.5x speed in terms of, getting through these games, which means I don't really get to listen to commentary. If I say somebody's name wrong, I apologize. Like, obviously, let me know in the comment section. I will fix it for subsequent videos. I can only really go off of their gameplay, not necessarily perfectly pronouncing their name. I'm always happy to switch things up if I am pronouncing someone like Namgung's name wrong. And, obviously, we'll talk about him a bit more later. But no actual retentions here. All 5 members of this team are new going into 2026 and different from 2025. The rest of OK BRION kind of splintering off in different directions. Hype, I believe, the only one who does not have a tier 1 job going into next year, which is really unfortunate considering he was the one player that I felt the best about, at least in terms of upside coming out of last year. But we can just go top to support in terms of breaking this down. Actually, I think it's probably a bit easier to go from veteran to, rookie in terms of how this breaks down, starting with Teddy in the AD carry role. Teddy is Teddy. Like, there's not really much to say about him as a player at this point. He is exactly what he has been the past couple of years, which is to say a fine AD carry at this level, an average to maybe slightly below average ADC for the LCK in 2026, and he's a very specific style. He's very not aggressive, very passive, especially in terms of his laning phase, is just kind of going to sit back and wait for the game to come to him if he's in a good enough spot resource-wise, if especially the enemy bot lane drafts a weak 2v2 and doesn't invest resources into trying to stay stable in that lane. lane and he's up his, 30, 35-ish CS or whatever, he can be useful in late game team fights. He's never going to be stepping up and being really aggressive like Diablo or someone like that will be. But, if you let him execute, he can execute. It's just on the flip side of that, he doesn't really win games on his own. He's entirely dependent on whether or not his team is good or bad. And he's good in situations where the rest of his team is generating resources. He can be productive in that situation. But Teddy is entirely a byproduct of what the rest of his team looks like. He is basically nothing individually as a player at this point, and he has been that for quite a few years. I know that's not a popular take, but it's one that I've held. B- I think is entirely fair for that. He is the kind of player that can function really well if the rest of his team is good, and if the rest of his team is bad, he's going to have a good KDA, and his DPM is going to be the lowest in the entire league. Like, that's just, it's what we've seen from Teddy over the course of his career. I am fine with him getting another job. I know he's very popular. I've always been a bit lower, but moving on to the other players who have played in the LCK that I'm interested in seeing. Gideon, we just talked about him with Nongshim. He was really good for most of last year. I'm not going to say he was phenomenal. I'm not going to say he was a perfect player or anything like that, but for the most part in 2025, he did show that growth trajectory that we were looking for. He had gotten better almost every single year. Started out, on that Invictus gaming team over in the LPL, came over to Bro here and kind of made a mid-year substitution with Gen.G that obviously didn't really end up working out for Bro, but Gideon looked really good on this BRION team that was a disaster when he was on it. Goes over to Nongshim last year and, like I said, really kind of emerged as, I don't want to say like a top half jungler in the league, but for most of last year, he was a top half jungler in the LCK. He was somewhere around like the 5th best jungler in the LCK, and that's a really good outcome for someone like Gideon, especially because he's continued to improve, but it kind of fell off. The wheels just generally fell off for Nongshim in the summer split, and you're not really surprised to see him be one of the casualties of that. Jungle is a position that really does not work if the rest of your team is completely inting. I really like Gideon. I think this is a good pickup. I think especially, Krako is always going to be a bit of a stopgap. I like Krako. I think he's a bit underrated as a player, but he's certainly not like a star. He's the definition of, again, another B- player, very similar to Teddy in the fact that he's going to be fine at this level, but not like a star. Gideon has like genuine upside where he could turn into a B+ or a B caliber player, and if he was that this year, it wouldn't be entirely all that surprising. I'm just kind of betting against it mostly because of the surrounding core with this roster. I think it's much weaker than what Gideon had to work with last year, but we've also seen him on bad teams before, like this Bro team, and he's performed well in those instances. I do think he should be kind of the centralizing force of how this team plays the game, alongside casting on the top side, who we will get into, but, I am excited for the Gideon pickup. I think he's a good player. The final player who has, significant time starting in the LCK is Fisher. I'm just not a Fisher guy. He's gotten better, at least since coming back to the LCK. He was terrible in the LPL when he finally got his chance on Edward Gaming, was completely unplayable on that team, and I was stunned when Nongshim picked him up and started him and, brought him back for 2025. It was like a true shock to me because of just how bad he was in his tenure before that, but he was fine, below average, but not like a disaster at the beginning of 2025. He did get replaced by Calyx, which was a good move. Nongshim definitely got better the moment Fisher was benched, which is never really a good sign for a team like this, but clearly Gideon and Fisher like playing with each other because they wouldn't be doing it again here on OK Bro if they weren't, kind of a bit of a duo here in the mid jungle. They had okay chemistry. Fisher, there are worse players than Fisher in terms of, players who have consistently gotten starting jobs both in the LCK and the LPL, but he does not really inspire confidence for me as a player. I'm just not really all that in on the upside of what he can become. His floor is incredibly low, and I think his ceiling is quite low as well. This is a downgrade to me. This is the only downgrade that isn't like a change on this roster, because Closer genuinely was very good for this team last year, was actively carrying them, especially at the beginning of the year. Didn't end super strong, but that's kind of standard for bad teams. You kind of lose your mental at some point. Fisher is definitely worse than Closer, and I doubt he will get better at any point throughout this year, or be better than what Closer was for this team last year at any point this year, so you kind of have to consider this a bit of a downgrade. And then we start to get to the young players, and this is where the conversation gets a bit more exciting. Obviously, I like the Gideon pickup, but I really like the casting pickup for this team as well. On the top side, of course, the KT Challengers top laner from last year. This is a guy that I was really excited to see get some time for KT. I like Perfect more as a prospect, but casting is certainly not someone that you can completely overlook, and I think he can be a relatively good top laner. I consider this a change. Morgan, we talked about this a bit in the LCS video, and I'm not sure people were all the way in on my take on this, but it's very clear that Morgan was on the downturn at the end of last year. He was okay at the beginning of the year and, has obviously been good for Bro before, has been like a top 5-ish top laner pretty consistently for Bro throughout the past couple of years, but you go watch him in spring and summer, his mechanics just really declined. His laning stats were really bad throughout a lot of last year. You can give a bit of the tax, like I said, too. The team was bad, his mental was checked out, all of that stuff, but part of the reason the team was bad is because they were putting a lot of responsibility on Morgan's shoulders, and he wasn't really doing all that much with it, wasn't playing particularly really well. So bringing in someone like Casting that probably has a pretty similar floor to what Morgan was for this team last year, and yet has a significantly higher upside, has the mechanics to actually be a very relevant player at this level, it's an exciting bring on. I think the only frustrating part of all of this is that you had a bunch of KT Challengers players like Hype and like Hambach. I guess Hype was technically a loan, I believe. He was still contracted to KT and they loaned him out to Bro. But you had all these KT Challengers players on the team last year, and you got rid of all of them and then brought in Casting now. I think I would have been more interested in this team if it were Casting and Hype on this team. If Hype was like the one player to come back from last year, if you were able to strike a deal with KT, or you probably didn't even need to. Hype's not even on KT right now. So, you know, if you just brought Hype in as your starting AD carry, I think I would be a bit more excited, but at least they got Casting. I think that's some upside on the top side. And then there's Namgung in the support position. He's a really difficult player to analyze in terms of his tape in the Gen.G system, because that was a team that, and this is something that I want to get out there, like the Gen.G Challengers Academy team generally plays weird. Like they never actually spotlight any of their players, and it makes it really hard to evaluate whether any of them are going to be good. That was the case for Quid for a very long time. Obviously going over to the LCS, it turns out that guy is really good, and obviously we'll see in the LPL whether or not About is going to be in a similar spot. But that's what makes Namgung so difficult to try and analyze, is once again for Gen.G, or their Academy team, they just focused entirely on one player, and that was About, and that meant that Namgung looked pretty good because the bot lane in general was pretty solid, of course About being the AD carry for that team. But it also was like, okay, his entire game plan is getting his AD carry into a good spot. He wasn't really playmaking across the map. He wasn't really playing with his jungler. Like, there wasn't a lot to look at in terms of him being like a big macro threat for the team. He was really 2v2 focused, and maybe that just is his game as a player, but I don't want to sit there and say that that is what the case is for anybody coming out of this Gen.G Academy system, because they almost never spotlight multiple lanes, and they're always very specific in their playstyle. So just with that context of the history of this team, I'm willing to say Namgung has a lower floor than I think someone like Casting does as a prospect coming in, because again, the well-roundedness of his game is just not there on tape right now, but I think the upside is still very much there. Don't take the C+ as me saying that he's not a good prospect or not a good bring in here. I just think that there is more inherent risk to this player because he didn't have to do as much in tier 2 as maybe someone like Casting did, or other supports that have come up through the system have had to do. I'm hopeful that he's good. I think Teddy is a good mentor to be able to bring in, but Namgung is going to have to be significantly more active on the map. You know, going from About to Teddy is like as much of a playstyle switch as you can possibly get in the bot lane. About is very much a centralizing player that wants to play strong side and get a lot of leads for the team, whereas Teddy, very much weak side player, doesn't really want to play aggressive in the early game, and so hopefully he can kind of be a bit more versatile in his game than what we saw in tier 2, but there are questions for this Bro team. I like certain additions, Casting and Gideon in particular. Even Namgung, I like those additions. I think they're good picks. Fisher and Teddy, I'm significantly less excited about. I just don't really see the upside, especially with the Fisher signing. Teddy's fine. His floor is okay, and I understand he's very popular. He'll bring a lot of fans to this team. Not that they don't already have a ton because they're Bro, but, you know, Fisher, I just don't really get. It's a very weird signing, and overall, I think Bro is still going to be a bottom tier team. Hopefully, you can just start to develop some sort of identity and some sort of core here. It feels like every player that comes through the Bro system is out in a couple of years. Hopefully there is somebody on this team that you can start building around and genuinely start developing some sort of team identity or team culture at some point. But then moving on to our 9th team of the video, and this one is an interesting one to talk about. I think there are pluses and minuses to this offseason. Again, as we get to these lower teams, it's just really hard for them to hit home runs with every single position in terms of their offseason. It's DRX that was the second to last, the penultimate team here, at least in this video, and, you know, not a lot of retention going on this roster. 2 technical starting players from last year in Rich and Ondil are returning, but UCal is still here. He started most of the year for this team before getting benched at the end of the year. We'll talk about whether or not that was deserved and what I think I expect from UCal going into 2026, but 2 new players coming in, one from the Challengers League, one from the LCK in the bot lane, and I'm excited to kind of talk about what I think my expectations for them are. So DRX's roster in 2026 is looking like Rich in the top lane, Vincenzo in the jungle, UCal in the mid lane, Jiwoo at AD carry, and Ondil at support. The players that are returning, I'm going to talk about Ondil first because he was kind of the first one locked in for this roster. Continue to be stunned by the fact that, you know, Plata is not the choice for DRX. I don't know what they're seeing that we are not, because clearly they have more access to scrims and games and, you know, information on these players than we ever will. But like the fact that Ondil is starting over Plata just it confounds me, right? Like I don't really get it. I'm going to be entirely frank with you. I just don't really understand. Ondil has kind of been a significantly below average support every single time he's played in in the LCK, regardless of the organization that he's played for. He had a reputation a bit on the Guangdong Freecs, for me at the very least, of playing really well when he would first start playing, either at the beginning of a split, if he would start as a starter, or if he were to replace somebody coming in as kind of a, last minute change. He would play really well for a couple of weeks and then would completely fall off and become the worst support in the league after like 2 or 3 weeks. And, people kind of got used to him. I don't really know why that ended up being a trend for Ondol throughout the beginning part of his career, but what we saw last year was the exact example of like a C+ player. He was a weak starter. He was somebody who had certain games where he was fine, had certain games where he wasn't very fine, generally equated to being like the 9th-ish best support in the LCK, and I'm just not all that interested in that guy getting brought back, especially because he was the first player that was confirmed for this roster in 2026. It just feels like a very weird thing for them to do. I'm just not a huge fan of building around Ondol, especially when I think you had a support that had like true like superstar upside. I'm not going to sit here and say that Playtech could become the best support in the world, but do I think he was about as good as like any of the other supports that became the best supports in the way? Like him versus Duro, like was there any like real major difference between those two from a talent perspective when they were both like young prospects? I don't think so. It just is really strange to me that this org continues to move in a different direction, but Ondol's fine. He's whatever. He's, again, the definition of a C+ player. Below average, but not, like, offensively bad. The other player to talk about that is technically returning is Rich in the top lane. Rich is fine. Again, another very specific player. We've talked about a couple of players like him throughout this video so far. A bad laner, good team fighter, at least in the top lane role. Obviously, at a high-end level, that's someone like Doran, but I think realistically he compares pretty favorably to someone like Shiwu. I expect Shiwu to be much better than someone like Rich moving forward, but those two have been compared together a lot over the course of the last year. Rich is fine. He's a B- for me. He's not quite a C+. Like, I think last year going into the year, I had him as like a C+ caliber player, but he was honestly fine. Last year, his laning stats weren't as bad as you would have expected them to be, and his team fighting continues to be an asset towards the team. I don't think he's a great player. Like, he's never someone that's going to break in and actually like break out and kind of change up his style, but very similar to what we talked about with someone like Teddy, who's obviously leaving this organization, leaving this team. He does one thing really well, and you can't really be all that mad at him for that, right? Like, at least he does something at a decent level. You just know what you're going to get out of Rich, which is an average starter, like the definition of an average top lane starter, in my opinion, in terms of output. And then you have Yucal, who's technically not coming back. He wasn't the starter at the end of the year. Yehu was. He goes over to the LEC, but Yucal was the starter for this team for a majority of the year, and Yucal had the strangest 2025 that you could possibly ask for. This guy came back over from the LPL after spending multiple years on Thunder Talk over in that region, where he was great. He was hard carrying that Thunder Talk team, and most of the time had zero support and was still kind of dragging them to at least like pseudo playoff relevance. Like, they were not good in the playoffs, but the fact that they were in the playoffs at all was like almost entirely because of Yucal. He comes back to the LCK with a lot of expectation, at the very least from me, and in the LCK Cup, he lives up to it. This team is relevant in the LCK Cup. They're a borderline top 6-ish team in the LCK throughout a lot of winter, and Yucal is dominating people. His laning stats look incredible. He is passing the eye test. Like, everything you wanted to see out of Yucal coming back to the LCK, we saw on DRX. And then spring happens. Like, the official season starts, the LCK Cup is over, and spring split starts, and he is terrible. I mean, truly, like, the worst player in the LCK. He's right there with Hambach in terms of just bleeding resources, getting obliterated in lane, making mistakes in the mid game. I have no clue what happened to this guy in the spring split, but he deserved to get benched in terms of the way he was playing in spring. It was just unacceptable, the form he had, and it was weird. Like there's nothing else to say. He was really good for years before that, and then just kind of fell off a cliff. Goes down to the Challengers League and plays for DRX Challengers, a team that pretty notoriously does well in a lot of the Challengers League tournaments, or at least has over the past like half a decade or so. And he's awesome for that team. He's easily the best player on DRX Challengers, continues to perform well at a tier 2 level. I think it's the right call to give him another shot here. Spring kind of has to be a bit of an outlier for me. Like, it's just so different than everything else we've seen from Yucal. His form has been so much better in almost every other circumstance that I'm honestly kind of leaning towards him being good this year. I think with the better team around him and just kind of getting over whatever the problem was in spring of last year, I have to imagine that he's going to be more playable. So I have him as a B- because I think that's the highest you can put him after how terrible he was in spring. He was like a C or a C- in spring, but he was like a B+, borderline player before that. Like, genuinely a very good player. I think he is a good bet to take on as a starter. Do I think he's definitely going to be good? No, I think there is a bad floor here, right? We saw that in spring, but I think this is the right kind of punt that you should be taking if you're DRX, and you already had him under contract. He should be starting for this team. So those are kind of the retentions. You bring over Jiwoo from Nongshim. This is a buy low on a player that has shown good traits in the past, and I can't be all that mad about that. Like, at least you're punting on somebody who has traits. I don't think Jiwoo is like the worst player in the universe. He was not very good last year for a Nongshim team that really needed him to be good. He just wasn't, and him coming in to replace Teddy, like, the floor is so much lower. Jiwoo was definitely worse than Teddy, even though I had him ranked above Teddy going into last year, but that's the whole thing, right? Like, coming out of 2024, Jiwoo was the player on Nongshim that we were like, oh, they can build around this guy. Like, he might be a top tier 80 carry at some point in his career, and it just all fell apart in 2025 when he had to play with Lehens, and, you know, that mental got broken. Like, I don't know what the problem was, but there still is a good prospect somewhere in there for Jiwoo. I think there are worse 80 carries to take punts on. There are obviously 80 carries that I wish were in the league that are not, but, you know, Jiwoo is a player that I'm totally fine you saying, like, well, we think 2025 was a bit of an outlier for him, and if he can get back to what he was at the end of 2023 and really throughout all of 2024, this guy is like that version of him was like a true prospect, like a top 4 or 5-ish 80 carry on his best days with that Nongshim team, and then he got a better team and it all fell apart. So I'm hopeful for Jiwoo. I think this gives you more upside than you ever had with Teddy, even if the floor, again, is significantly lower. Then the final player to talk about here is Vincenzo. He's coming off of an MVP in the Challengers League. You know, by the tone of my voice, you can probably get the opinion that I had of that MVP. I just don't think I would have given that to him. He was good, don't get me wrong. He was a productive player for T1 Challengers in the Challengers League. He was arguably the best jungler in the league. Winner, I think, also had a decently strong argument for that. Grizzly, I can't even believe I overlooked that. Grizzly was really good in the Challengers League last year, but Vincenzo, I think, had an argument for being the best jungler. MVP felt like a stretch. I think Casting probably would have been my MVP of the Challengers League. It really felt like he had the most impact in a role that's pretty difficult to be like an MVP caliber player in the top lane, but Vincenzo's a good player. I just worry a bit about the playstyle fit here with someone like Yukal and with Rich and with Jiwoo, these players that I would not consider to be aggressive, right? Vincenzo wants to play a little bit faster in terms of how he plays the game, and I'm just not quite sure that's a good fit here. I think his floor is a little bit lower than people are giving him credit for. His game is not as well-rounded as maybe you'll get out of other top-tier prospects. He won MVP for a reason, though. This guy, mechanically speaking, is very good, and I do think he earned a spot in the LCK this year. We've just seen this story so many times. Sponge is actually a really great comparison for what Vincenzo, I think, looked like in the Challengers League. Not to say the LCK version of Sponge, but the Challengers League version of Sponge that I was really excited about seeing in the LCK, where I was like, oh, he has his deficiencies in terms of being consistent in the mid game, isn't really good at playing from behind, but he's talented and he generates resources, and that's what you want to see. And then Sponge couldn't generate resources at the LCK level, and he couldn't really play the game, was actively detrimental to his team. I'm worried that that is an outcome that is possible for a player like Vincenzo, but, you know, generally speaking, I like the process of bringing in the MVP of the Challengers League and kind of building around him, especially because you have veterans on this team like Yukal and like Rich, who have been around forever, that can really, you know, stabilize him on the top side of the map. Even players like Jiwoo and Ondel have had a lot of experience in the LCK, have played more than a full year. You know, he's the only rookie on this team, which I think is generally a good process. So, you know, I think DRX had an okay offseason. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, they won the offseason and they killed it, but I think I'm a bit higher on this team than maybe others are. I don't think it's going to be there in year one, but I like the process. I think bringing Yukal back is a good decision. I think buying low on Jiwoo is fine, and Vincenzo is a good pickup. Rich was fine last year. I'm not as much of a fan of the Ondel, you know, re-signing here or bringing him back and kind of committing to him, but most of the things on this team I kind of agree with, and I think DRX, at the very least, should be interesting going into 2026. But that's going to bring us to our 10th and final team of the video here, and it's a team that speed ran 10th place last year and definitely made some changes this offseason, but not nearly as many as I expected them to make. It's the DN Freecs as the final team we will be talking about here today. They have 2 members returning, which is 2 more than I thought they would have after their disastrous 2025. It really just felt like everything fell off the rails for the Freecs, basically from day number 1. They were okay at I believe game number 1. They ended up facing Nongshim, and I believe they won that off the back of Berserker playing really well in the LCK Cup, and I don't think they picked up another win for like 4 more months, something ridiculous like that. Like, it really got bad as fast as it possibly could in a hurry for this team. So not surprised to see them make pretty big wholesale changes, but the fact that they retained the top side of the map, very much surprising to me. Not that I think, like, it's the worst decision in the world. I think Pioshik is bad. I'm going to be honest, it's a stunner to me that Pyosik came back. I thought he was, of all of the players on this team, the worst last year, and so for him to be one of the few players returning, certainly a shock. And then, Dudu, we'll talk about him, but for the rest of this team, some good and some bad with them. Their lineup in 2026 is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Pyosik in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Duckdom at AD carry, and Peter at support. I guess we'll get to the DN Freecs players right now. I guess the holdovers from 2025, Dudu and Pyosik on the top side. Dudu's fine. He's the one player I feel okay about bringing back because last year was such an outlier for him. This was a player that I was really hyping up in 2023 and really kind of going to bat for, even 2024 to a lesser extent, although I do think he was worse in 2024. This was a player that was kind of on the cusp of really breaking out as one of the better top laners in the LCK, which I don't think a lot of people remember because, people kind of associate the Freecs with being bad, but even in 2023, that team was mediocre, like they were okay, and Dudu was kind of carrying them in basically every single game. He was awful last year. He was clearly very mentally checked out by the end of the year and wasn't particularly locked in on a lot of the games, but again, you kind of have to hope that that version of him that was really solid, even just a couple of years ago, is still there within him as a player. I think there's more traits to be able to rely on for a player like Dudu than there is for someone like Pyosik, which we are going to kind of talk about in a second. B- is very generous considering where he was at last year, and I'm going to spoil a bit of the power rankings here. He's not going to rank very highly in terms of my top lane player rankings when we do my winter split preview video in just a couple of weeks, but, at least generally speaking, I don't think it's a terrible idea to bring him back and kind of bank on the upside that you saw originally when you brought him in to this team, where he ended up overperforming a lot and how he's become kind of a staple of the organization since then. But Pyosik coming back, I think, is completely unacceptable. I don't even really understand why he finished out the year with this team. They had Void down in the Challengers League for their team, and Void was playing really well in the Challengers League. He came up and played a couple of games at the LCK level, and he wasn't perfect, but he at the very least was like playable for this team, and then they just go right back to Pyosik and they continue to lose again, and it's so confusing to me. Pyosik's washed. Like, there's nothing else really to say. It is clear that he just does not have it anymore. Pyosik was one of my favorite players in the world in 2021, 2022, those DRX teams that I kind of go to bat for a lot. 2021 DRX is kind of, the team that got me really back into the LCK, watching every single game. I just really loved that collection of rookie talent in the spring split. And then obviously 2022 DRX wins Worlds and Pyosik becomes a world champion. All of that awesome stuff. He goes over to North America. He's fine there, but he's really not exceptional. And ever since then, he's just been bad. There's really not much to say. He comes back to the LCK and is, I would say below average for KT Rolster on a team that always looked like it was going to fail, was reheating the DRX nachos without, the most important player on that team in Zeka, which is a bit of a problem. And then last year, he was a nightmare for this team. He was in conversation for being the worst player in the LCK throughout a majority of last year. C+ is almost entirely off the idea that he has been good at some point before, that he is a world champion and that he's had success. This guy was nowhere close to being a C+, and I honestly don't even know if I project him as a C+ going into this year. He's probably closer to being a C-graded player. I think he's the weakest player in the LCK that has a starting job right now. I hope he proves me wrong and proves that there is something still left in the tank for him as a player, at the top end level, but there's not a lot of tape to actually believe in to tell me that that's going to be the case. I really do not like this retention. Again, even if you just internally promoted someone like Void from last year from your Challengers League team, I think that would have been preferable. And then you get to the changes. This is where you get a little bit more positive on the DN Freecs, although it's hard to go down from where they were at last year. Starting in the mid lane, they bring Closer over from Bro. Closer's obviously been a long-time LCK mid laner, but I do think he actually unlocked something a little bit different last year. I was never a big fan of Closer. In fact, I was pretty anti-Closer on this channel for a pretty long time when he was on Sandbox and on FearX. I was just really kind of against him getting all the hype that he got. It felt like he had a big hype train from his time on T1 as a player who played under Faker and just kind of never let go of that. He ended up getting really overvalued in 2022 when Krako, Prince, and Kyle were playing really well for that Sandbox team, and he was kind of along for the ride. He got an All-Pro. I think he got third team All-Pro that split, and he absolutely did not deserve that, and ever since then, he's kind of just been inflated in terms of his perception. But I do think he actually started to kind of live up to that last year on Bro when he was the only player that was actively consistently winning games for that team. Do I think that that's super sustainable for him? I don't know. I'm ranking him as a B, so, basically what he was last year, around about the 5th, 6th best mid laner. The best of the rest is the way I always say it. The best of the rest mid laner in the LCK. Outside of the big five, there's a big cluster of everyone else. I think Closer was better than all of the other, options at that position last year. Do I think he will be that this year? I have no clue. DNF kind of churns out every single player that they bring in. They just make them worse, and then the team ends up collapsing. It's kind of become regular. This organization has become kind of the face of underperforming in the LCK, so I hope the closer can maintain that good form that he had in 2025, but I'd be lying if I said I was hopeful for that. And speaking of, lack of faith, you're bringing in the KT Rolster bot lane, the bot lane that just made World Finals. Duktum and Peter, love Peter. This is a great addition. I think Peter is a great addition to any team, and if there is a reason for me to be excited about this, I think it's because I think Peter can stabilize so many different teams and atmospheres. I think he's so vocal, and I think that he's just such a positive influence. His gameplay is really solid. He's a really good playmaker and an engager, as I talked about in the KT Rolster section. Like, this is an upgrade. Like, getting a player like this, I think, is really positive for an organization that is yet to find any sort of stability or really any good vibes at all. Peter is absolutely going to be bringing good vibes to this team, and I think that if you're ever going to be excited about an addition, bringing Peter in and even bringing like Closer and Peter in as a duo here, I think is really positive. I think both of these players are coming off of really good years, and hopefully you're getting good versions of them. Now for Duktum, I don't know if I feel as good about Duktum here. Berserker, he wasn't great last year, but I still give him a B grade because so much of it felt like the atmosphere and just the general vibe of the team rather than his individual performances. Duktum is a very different player. Berserker much more carry-oriented. It's why he always succeeded in NA. Duktum much more jack-of-all-trades, master of none, as I've always called him. He's fine as an addition. I like Duktum. I think he's like regularly an average, AD carry at this level. I've always compared him to FBI over in North America. I think they're very similar players in the way that they play the game, and they're also similar in the way that they kind of fail to play the game. Obviously, Duktum's better because he plays in a better environment, but he's fine. He'll be the 5th-ish best AD carry in the LCK. Maybe he'll be a bit worse. Like, there have definitely been times where he's been a bit worse. For most of last year, at least the beginning part of last year, he was like the 10th or 9th best AD carry in the league until Peter came in and really stabilized, but him and Peter seem to have good chemistry as a duo. Duktum started playing much better at the end of the year and obviously did a really good job at Worlds of being able to push the team forward. You're hopeful that you're going to get a good result out of him, but quite frankly, the biggest concern for me when it comes to this team is that it's Freecs, is that it's this organization who just seem to miss every year. It doesn't even really matter who gets brought in. I'm not going to believe in this team and this org until they figure things out. I've actually been very vocal on this channel. There have been so many players that have come through the DNF system that have been truly and properly mismanaged, mistaught, mistrained. Like Bulldog, I think, is a great example of this. Bulldog came in as a super mechanically talented mid laner from the Challengers League at 17 years old, was the youngest player in the LCK, and had a really good rookie year. And every single year since then, he's gotten worse and worse and worse. And the reason for it has been very apparent. He shifted his mindset from being a carry-oriented player that wants to win in the 1v1 to a player that sacrifices all of his resources in order to play for his lanes. He's become selfless, but in a way that completely destroys the value that he originally brought to a team, because he's no longer generating resources and, letting his jungler play more aggressive with his lane leads. That's the kind of mismanagement that I think DNF has kind of been known for me over the past couple of years. I think this org is kind of rotten from the inside out, and until they prove that they are not that anymore, this is a team that's going to continue to get bad grades for me. I don't care what kind of talent is on this team. It's really tough to believe in an organizational structure that has consistently failed every player that has come through it over the past couple of years, and hopefully this is the team that could turn things around, but I'd be lying if I said I was hopeful on that. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK 2026 off-season roster grades video. Do hope you guys enjoyed. Obviously, it's always exciting to make these videos. It's fun to go over just the general vibe that a lot of these teams have, but let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments section below. I'm always so curious where, again, you guys are with me, where you're not with me. I know I don't have the most consensus takes in the world. I feel like that's what makes this channel, fun and special. And again, I reiterate this in a lot of other videos, but if I wasn't a little bit, or at the sometimes a bit more accurate than a lot of the other analysts or general consensus out there, I wouldn't keep doing this. But one of the reasons I feel so confident in putting a lot of these thoughts out there is that a lot of my takes have aged pretty well on this channel. Hopefully some of these age well in that same vein. But again, let me know what you think is going to age really poorly, what you think might age really well. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below. We're going to have the LPL version of this video out very shortly, very soon, hopefully sometime in the next week or so. Of course, the LPL is a nightmare to try and go over because they have 85 million teams, but if you like the LPL, go ahead and check out the links in the description to both the YouTube and the Twitch for LPL English. I am an official caster this upcoming year for LPL English, as I was at the end of last year, and Demacia Cup is right around the corner. I will be part of that as a broadcasting team, and I'll be doing a couple of games, couple of days here and there over the course of this December, and then of course all of the LPL season I will be on as well. And like I said, that LPL roster grades video is going to drop shortly. I got this out before Kespa. That was my goal, and I'm glad I was able to get that done. So again, hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like and subscribe. You know, again, more videos coming soon. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all